Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the unglamorous corridors of history. I hope this video finds you well wherever you might be, perhaps tucked into bed as the day winds down, or settled into a comfortable chair as evening descends. If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the parts of the past that textbooks prefer to skip over. If you've been with us before, thank you for returning. Before we begin, I should mention that if you enjoy these deep dives into historical reality, the subscribe button is just below this video. No pressure, of course, but it does help ensure that more of these lengthy explorations of the past's less glamorous moments find their way to you. Tonight, we're venturing into a place that popular culture has utterly romanticized: the Viking Tavern. You've seen them in television shows and films, haven't you? Roaring fires, frothing tankards of golden ale, warriors laughing boisterously while bards sing in the corner, clean wooden tables, attractive serving women with perfect teeth, everyone having a marvellous photogenic time. The reality, I'm afraid to say, was rather different. Picture, if you will, a dimly lit space. Not the atmospheric dimness of a modern gastropub, but the genuine gloom of a place lit only by a sputtering central fire and perhaps a few oil lamps. The air is thick enough to chew, smoke has nowhere to go because there's barely any ventilation, and it hangs at head height, making everyone's eyes water. The smell hits you before you even enter. Unwashed bodies, stale ale, vomit, smoke, animal waste, and something else. Something sour and organic that you can't quite identify. This is where Vikings gathered to drink, and over the next few hours, we're going to explore every uncomfortable, unhygienic, and often quite disturbing detail of these establishments. We'll examine the structures themselves, the ale they served, the vessels people drank from, and the various ways that drinking spaces became vectors for disease, violence, and death. We'll talk about the people who worked in these places, the social hierarchies they reinforced, and the countless small miseries that accompanied the act of communal drinking in the Viking Age. I should warn you, this is not a romantic vision. There will be no valiant warriors here, no noble feasts, just the grinding, filthy reality of trying to get drunk in an era without plumbing, germ theory, or any meaningful health regulations. But that's what we do here, isn't it? We look at history not as it's been sanitized for television, but as it actually was, in all its uncomfortable, sometimes shocking detail. So settle in, get comfortable, let the day's tensions drift away, and let's explore together the filthy truth about Viking taverns, in exhaustive, methodical, and yes, quite boring detail. Let's begin. When we speak of Viking Age taverns, we're discussing a specific time and place in history. The Viking Age, broadly defined, spans from approximately 793 CE, the raid on Lindisfarne Monastery, to 1066 CE, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. That's roughly 270 years of history, though of course drinking establishments existed in Scandinavia both before and after these dates. Geographically, we're focused primarily on Norway, Sweden and Denmark, though Viking settlements and trading posts stretch from Newfoundland to Constantinople. The drinking spaces we'll examine tonight existed across this entire range, but we'll concentrate on the Scandinavian heartland, where the majority of the population lived and where archaeological evidence is most abundant. The climate of Scandinavia during this period was marginally warmer than it is today, what climatologists call the medieval warm period, but this is relative. We're still talking about a place where winter could last 6 months, where darkness dominated half the year, where temperatures regularly plunged below freezing for extended periods. The environment shaped every aspect of Viking life, including how and where they drank. Urban centres during this period were small by our standards. Hedeby, one of the largest Viking Age towns, probably housed between 1,000 and 2,000 people at its peak. Birka, another significant trading centre, was similar in size. Most settlements were smaller still, villages of a few dozen to a few hundred people. Yet even in these modest communities, there were spaces dedicated to drinking, or at least spaces where drinking was a primary activity. It's important to understand that the concept of a tavern in the Viking Age was not what we might imagine today. There were no purpose-built bars as we know them, no commercial establishments with business licenses and health inspections. Instead, drinking typically occurred in sections of longhouses, the large rectangular structures that served as homes, workshops and gathering spaces. Wealthier households might have a dedicated hall for feasting and entertaining, while poorer homes would simply clear space in the main living area. Some households developed reputations for serving good ale and became informal gathering places. Women in these households would brew regularly and welcome guests, sometimes for free as a display of hospitality, sometimes for barter or payment. Over time, certain locations became known as the places to drink, particularly in urban areas where travellers needed accommodation and locals wanted somewhere to gather outside their own cramped homes. To understand Viking drinking culture, we must first understand the role of alcohol in Norse society. Ale was not merely a recreational beverage. It was safer to drink than water in many cases, provided calories in a diet often short on food, served as a social lubricant in a culture that valued communal bonds, and played a central role in religious rituals and legal proceedings. Water sources in Viking Age settlements were frequently contaminated. Rivers and streams served multiple purposes: washing, waste disposal, water supply. The same water that flowed past a settlement might have already passed dozens of farms upstream, each contributing its share of human and animal waste. Wells could be cleaner, but they could also become contaminated, and there was no way to tell until people started getting sick. Ale, because it was boiled during production, and because the fermentation process created alcohol and acids that inhibited some bacterial growth, was marginally safer. Not safe. We'll discuss the many ways ale could and did make people sick, but safer than the alternatives. Children drank small ale, a weak brew with minimal alcohol content. Adults drank stronger versions. The very poor, who couldn't afford regular ale, drank whatever they could get, which often meant contaminated water and its attendant diseases. Beyond simple survival, alcohol served crucial social functions. In a culture without written contracts, important agreements were sealed with drinking ceremonies. Legal assemblies, the things, included ritualized drinking. Marriage agreements were formalized over ale. Funerals featured elaborate drinking rites. A person's status could be measured partly by their ability to provide ale to guests. Generosity with alcohol was a mark of wealth and honour. The Norse concept of hospitality, too, revolved around drinking. A good host provided ale to visitors. A stingy host who hoarded drink was socially condemned. This wasn't just about being nice. In a harsh environment where travel was dangerous and settlements were scattered, hospitality was a survival mechanism. You offered ale to travellers because someday you might be the traveller needing shelter. Religious practices incorporated alcohol extensively. Sacrifices to the gods often involved ale poured on altars or into sacred spaces. Drinking toasts to various gods was a central element of religious feasts. Some scholars argue that certain religious ceremonies required participants to drink themselves into altered states of consciousness, viewing intoxication as a path to communion with the divine. But here's what's crucial to understand. All of this drinking, the social drinking, the religious drinking, the seal-important agreements drinking, happened in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The cultural importance of alcohol did not translate into any understanding of hygiene, sanitation, or the disease risks inherent in communal drinking. Over the next 2.5 hours or so, we're going to systematically examine every aspect of Viking Age drinking establishments that popular culture prefers to ignore. We'll start with the physical structures themselves and move through the ale that was served, the vessels it was drunk from, and the people who made these spaces function. We'll explore the sensory reality of these places, the smells, the sounds, the textures underfoot. We'll investigate the violence, disease, and death that accompanied Viking drinking culture. This is not meant to shame or mock the Vikings. They were people trying to survive in a difficult world with the knowledge and resources available to them. But it's important to understand that survival in the Viking Age meant accepting conditions that we would find intolerable. It meant drinking ale that contained floating debris because that was still better than the water. It meant sharing drinking vessels with strangers because individual cups were a luxury. It meant tolerating violence in drinking spaces because there was no police force to call, no security system to rely on. The gap between the Viking tavern of popular imagination and the Viking tavern of historical reality is vast. That gap exists because filmmakers and television producers need their sets to be visually appealing to modern audiences, and because there's something deeply uncomfortable about confronting how dirty, dangerous and disease-ridden ordinary life was for most of human history. But we're not here to be comfortable, we're here to understand. And understanding requires us to sit with that discomfort, to really imagine what it meant to drink in an age before germ theory, before public health, before any of the invisible infrastructure that keeps modern drinking spaces relatively safe. So let's begin with the basics. Let's start with the structures themselves, what Viking drinking spaces actually looked like, how they were built, and why their construction methods guaranteed that they would be dark, smoky, and deeply unpleasant places to spend time. Chapter 1. The alehouse structure. Let us begin with the structure itself, the actual building that housed Viking Age drinking activities. When you think of a tavern, you might picture a standalone establishment, a building specifically designed and built for the purpose of serving alcohol. Perhaps you imagine something like an English pub or a German beer hall, a structure with a clear commercial identity. Viking Age drinking spaces were almost never like this. The vast majority of drinking happened in sections of residential longhouses. These were the fundamental building blocks of Viking architecture, long rectangular structures, typically 15 to 30 metres in length and 5 to 8 metres in width. The walls were made from wood, wattle, and daub, or stone, depending on local materials and the wealth of the builder. The roof was usually turf, layers of sod laid over wooden beams, providing insulation but also adding tremendous weight to the structure. Inside a longhouse, space was divided functionally but not with fixed walls. A central hearth provided heat and light. Benches along the walls served as seats during the day and beds at night. Storage areas held food, tools and supplies. And in larger households, particularly those that became known for serving ale, one end of the structure would be designated as the drinking area. What made this truly brutal was the complete lack of separation between functions. The space where people drank was often mere feet from where animals were kept during winter. Vikings brought their most valuable livestock, horses, sometimes cattle, certainly smaller animals like pigs and chickens, inside during the coldest months to keep them from freezing. This was practical and necessary, but it meant that drinking occurred in an atmosphere thick with animal smells, surrounded by the sounds of livestock, and contaminated by the omnipresent dust of dried manure. Ventilation was minimal. A hole in the roof allowed smoke to escape, theoretically, but in practice much of it hung at head level, especially in winter when the last thing anyone wanted was to let cold air in. Windows were rare and small. Glass was a luxury beyond most people's means, and open windows meant losing precious heat. The result was a perpetual gloom, a dimness relieved only by the central fire and whatever oil lamps or tallow candles people could afford to keep burning. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that would be changed periodically, though periodically might mean once a season, not once a week. These floor coverings absorbed spills, vomit, and worse. They provided some insulation against the cold earth, but also harboured insects, rodents, and all manner of organic decay. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hedeby in Denmark shows the reality of these integrated spaces. Excavations have revealed drinking areas, identified by concentrations of drinking vessel fragments and ale brewing equipment, directly adjacent to areas with heavy animal waste deposits. The idea that you might maintain a pristine social space separate from the messy realities of livestock husbandry simply didn't exist. Everything happened in close proximity because space was limited and specialisation was a luxury. So the next time you see a Viking tavern in a film, all that atmospheric lighting, those clean wooden tables, that sense of a dedicated social space, remember that the reality was a smoky, dark, animal-scented section of a multi-purpose building where the boundaries between drinking area, living space and barn were minimal at best. This was just the beginning of the filth. Chapter 2. The ale itself. Now let's consider what Vikings actually drank when they gathered in these spaces. Modern craft beer culture has romanticised ale as a noble beverage, and there's a certain artisanal appeal to traditional brewing methods. But Viking Age ale was not the product of careful temperature control, sanitation protocols, or quality standards. It was whatever resulted from fermenting grain in whatever vessels were available, with minimal understanding of what was actually happening during the brewing process. The brewing began with malting, germinating grain, usually barley, sometimes wheat or rye, to convert starches into fermentable sugars, then drying it to halt germination. This part Vikings understood well enough through trial and error, but everything that followed was vulnerable to contamination. Mashing occurred in large wooden troughs or clay vessels. Hot water was added to the malted grain to extract sugars. These same vessels might be used for food preparation, for storing other substances, for any number of purposes. There was no concept of dedicating equipment solely to brewing to prevent cross-contamination. The water itself might be suspect, drawn from wells or streams that served multiple purposes. The resulting liquid, wort, was then fermented. This happened in open vessels, exposed to whatever wild yeasts and bacteria happened to be floating through the air. Sometimes brewers would reuse vessels without cleaning them, allowing the yeast residue from previous batches to start the new fermentation. This could work if the previous batch was successful, but it could also propagate problems from batch to batch. What made this truly disturbing was that Vikings had no understanding of microorganisms. They couldn't see bacteria or yeast. They didn't understand fermentation as a biological process. When a batch of ale went bad, souring, developing off flavours, growing visible mould, they might still drink it if they were desperate enough, because ale, even contaminated ale, was precious. The finished product was cloudy, chunky, and often contained visible particles, pieces of grain that hadn't fully dissolved, dead yeast, sediment from the bottom of fermentation vessels. This wasn't considered a defect. It was simply what ale looked like. Clear beer required filtration methods that wouldn't become standard for centuries. Insects inevitably found their way into brewing vessels. Flies were attracted to the sweet smell of fermenting grain. Sometimes their larvae would develop in the ale itself. In murky, opaque ale, small insects or insect parts would be invisible to the drinker. You might consume them without knowing. Extra protein, though hardly the kind anyone would choose. The alcohol content varied wildly depending on the skill of the brewer and the quality of ingredients. Strong ale might reach 6 or 7% alcohol, similar to some modern beers. Weak small ale might be only 2 or 3%. But there was no standardisation, no way to measure alcohol content, no labelling to tell you what you were drinking. Every horn or cup was a gamble. Storage presented its own challenges. Ale didn't keep long, a few days to a couple of weeks depending on strength and storage conditions. Without refrigeration, it would gradually sour as bacteria continued to work on the sugars and alcohol. What started as drinkable ale would become increasingly vinegary and unpleasant. But in a world of scarcity, unpleasant didn't necessarily mean won't be consumed. There are references in saga literature to bad ale that made people sick, that tasted foul, that was clearly spoiled. But there are also implicit references to people drinking this bad ale anyway, because it was what was available, because refusing hospitality was socially unacceptable, or because they were already drunk enough not to care about the taste. So when we talk about Vikings gathering to drink ale, We're not discussing anything resembling modern beer. We're talking about a contaminated, cloudy, chunky liquid that might contain any number of unwanted ingredients that varied wildly in quality and safety, and that people consumed because the alternatives were worse. It's hard not to feel a certain grudging respect for the Viking digestive system. Chapter 3. The drinking vessels. The containers from which Vikings drank created their own set of problems. We find three main types of drinking vessels in archaeological contexts: horns, wooden cups, and clay bowls. Each had specific disadvantages when it came to hygiene and disease transmission. Drinking horns, the iconic image of Viking drinking, were made from cattle horns, boiled and shaped, then fitted with metal rims or stands. They held between half a litre to a full litre of liquid. But here's the crucial design flaw. A horn cannot be set down unless it has a stand, and stands were relatively rare. This meant that once you filled a horn, you needed to drink it all or hold it continuously. The social expectation was to drain it, to empty the horn in one sustained drinking session. This created a culture of rapid consumption, of drinking more than you might have chosen if you could have paced yourself with a vessel that sat on a table. It meant getting drunk faster, more completely, more recklessly. But the greater problem with horns was their interior surface. Horn is porous organic material. Liquid seeps into microscopic crevices. Over time, with repeated use, horns would develop a biofilm, a coating of bacteria, yeast, and other microorganisms living in that perfect moist environment. Cleaning a horn properly requires boiling it, which risks damaging the material. Most Vikings probably just rinsed them with water between uses, if that. Every person who drank from a horn left traces of their mouth bacteria on the rim. The next person who drank from that horn would ingest those bacteria, and because horns were often shared, passed around the group, used communally, they became vectors for disease transmission. Oral bacteria, respiratory infections, even tuberculosis could spread through shared drinking vessels. Wooden cups were more common than horns, but posed similar problems. Wood is also porous. It also harbours bacteria in its grain. Repeated exposure to liquid causes wood to swell, crack, and degrade. Wooden drinking vessels couldn't be properly sanitised by any method available to Vikings. They might be scraped, rinsed, perhaps occasionally heated over a fire, but the biofilm would persist, would grow, would become home to increasingly diverse microbial colonies. Archaeological analysis of recovered wooden drinking cups has revealed the presence of oral bacteria from multiple individuals, evidence of shared use and incomplete cleaning. These cups were literally transferring biological material from mouth to mouth, person to person. Clay vessels were the third option, bowls or cups made from fired clay. These had the advantage of being non-porous, making them easier to clean than horn or wood. But cleaning still required effort, hot water, scrubbing materials, all of which were in limited supply, and clay vessels were fragile, easily broken, difficult to replace if you weren't near a potter. The sharing of drinking vessels wasn't optional. In a culture that valued communal drinking, refusing to drink from a shared horn or cup could be seen as insulting, as rejecting the social bonds that drinking was meant to reinforce. You drank from the same vessel as your companions because that's what participation in the community meant. Consider what this meant during disease outbreaks. When respiratory infections swept through a settlement, as they regularly did, shared drinking vessels ensured maximum transmission. The sick and the healthy would drink from the same horns at gatherings, spreading infection efficiently through the population. There was no concept of quarantine, no understanding that drinking from the same vessel as a sick person would make you sick too. If someone had a cough, a fever, visible signs of illness, they might still attend social drinking events and use the same vessels as everyone else. Because staying home when you were sick meant social isolation, meant missing important gatherings, meant potentially offending your host by refusing their hospitality. So drinking vessels, these simple containers, became instruments of disease transmission on a scale that Vikings couldn't have understood even if someone had tried to explain it to them. We can scarcely imagine willingly sharing a drinking vessel with strangers today, not after everything we've learned about disease transmission. But for Vikings, it was simply part of drinking socially. Chapter 4. The smell. Let's talk about what a Viking drinking space actually smelled like, because this is something that never appears in film depictions, but would have been the most immediately overwhelming aspect of entering these establishments. The human nose can detect thousands of distinct odours, and it's particularly sensitive to certain compounds, volatile organic chemicals produced by decay, fermentation, and bacterial activity. A Viking alehouse would have assaulted the nose with layer upon layer of these smells. Start with the most obvious, unwashed human bodies. Vikings bathed more regularly than many other medieval peoples. Archaeological evidence shows combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, suggesting attention to grooming. But more regularly than other medieval peoples still meant perhaps once a week, perhaps less during the harsh winter months when heating. Enough water for a full bath was a major undertaking, and bathing didn't include the chemical soaps and deodorants that modern people use to suppress natural body odours. 30 or 40 unwashed bodies in an enclosed space with minimal ventilation created a fug of human smell, sweat certainly, but also the oils from skin and hair, the bacteria that naturally live on human skin and produce odorous compounds, the general musk that humans emit when they haven't thoroughly washed in days. Layer on top of that the smell of stale ale, a sour, yeasty odour that would permeate everything. Spilled ale soaked into floor rushes, into wooden benches, into clothing. The smell of fermentation never left these spaces. Fresh ale being served would add its own scent, not unpleasant in itself, but mixing with all the other odours. Then there was vomit. Excessive drinking leads to vomiting. This was as true in the Viking Age as it is today. People who drank too much too quickly would vomit where they sat or stumble outside to vomit near the entrance. In winter, going outside meant exposure to brutal cold, so people were more likely to vomit indoors. Some of this would be cleaned up certainly, but some would soak into floor rushes, would dry in cracks in the wood, would leave permanent traces. Smoke from the central fire and from oil lamps added its acrid bite. This wasn't the pleasant smell of a campfire in the open air. This was smoke trapped in an enclosed space, hanging at face level, irritating eyes and throats. The particular smell of burning animal fat from tallow lamps, a greasy, distinctly unpleasant odour, would mix with wood smoke. But perhaps most disturbing was the animal smell. In spaces where livestock were kept in close proximity, where the boundaries between drinking area and animal area were minimal, the smell of animal urine and feces was inescapable. Manure has a sharp, ammonia-like quality that intensifies in enclosed spaces, combined with the smell of wet animal fur, of feed, of all the biological realities of keeping animals indoors. This created an agricultural overlay to everything else. The smell was so pervasive, so constant, that saga literature rarely mentions it. Modern scholars have noted this curious absence. Vikings wrote about the taste of ale, about the quality of hospitality, about who sat where, but almost never about smell. The most likely explanation is that the smell was so normal, so ever-present, that it didn't register as worthy of comment. This tells us something profound. Vikings lived in conditions that we would find so intolerably malodorous that we couldn't remain in them for more than a few minutes. But to them, this was simply background, the normal smell of social spaces. Their olfactory baseline was so different from ours that we can't even properly imagine adapting to it. Modern humans live in largely deodorized environments. We've used chemistry to suppress, mask, or eliminate most natural smells. Walking into a Viking alehouse would be like time travelling not just through history, but through an entirely different sensory reality. One where smell was simply something you endured rather than something you could control. So the next time you read about a Viking feast, try to imagine it not just visually but olfactorily. Imagine breathing that air, having those smells soak into your clothing and hair, accepting it as normal. Chapter 5. The Floor. Now let's look down at what Vikings walked on, sat on, and sometimes slept on in drinking establishments. The floor of a Viking Age alehouse reveals another layer of filth that popular culture consistently sanitizes. Most floors were packed earth, dirt compressed by thousands of footsteps into a relatively hard surface. In wealthier establishments there might be wooden planking over the earth, but this was far from universal. Earth floors had certain advantages. They were cheap, easy to repair if damaged, and provided good drainage for spilled liquids. That last point would be important in a space where large quantities of ale were consumed. But earth floors were also porous and absorbent. Everything that spilled on them, ale, vomit, blood, urine, would soak in. Over time, the earth would become saturated with organic materials. The top layer might be scraped away periodically, but the deeper contamination remained. To make these floors more comfortable and to provide some insulation against the cold, people spread rushes or straw over them. These were long grasses or straw gathered and scattered across the floor to create a softer surface to walk on. In theory, these would be changed regularly. In practice, regularly might mean seasonal changes, not daily or even weekly replacement. What happened to floor coverings in a space where people drank heavily? They absorbed every spill, every splash, every bodily fluid. Fresh rushes might last a few days before becoming thoroughly soaked with ale and other substances. As they became sodden, they would begin to rot, to ferment, to develop their own smell and texture. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age drinking areas have revealed remarkably intact floor layers. The waterlogged, anaerobic conditions preserved organic materials that would normally decay. What these excavations show is deeply unpleasant. Multi-year accumulations of organic debris, layer upon layer of compressed rushes mixed with food scraps, animal bones, and human waste. The truly disturbing finding is the presence of parasitic worm eggs in these floor layers. Specifically, eggs from intestinal parasites like roundworms and whipworms. These parasites are transmitted through the fecal-oral route. They get into soil or surfaces through human waste, then enter a new host when someone touches the contaminated surface and later touches their mouth, or through contaminated food. Finding these eggs in floor layers suggests that human feces in some form ended up on the floor. This might have been from people who were too drunk to go outside to relieve themselves, or from general contamination from dirty shoes and clothing. But the result was the same. The floor was contaminated with parasites, and anyone spending time in these spaces was at risk of infection. Children were particularly vulnerable. They crawled on these floors, played on them, put their hands on them, and then in their mouths, as children do. The parasite infection rates in Viking Age children were shockingly high. Skeletal and tissue analysis from well-preserved burials shows evidence of chronic parasitic infections that would have caused malnutrition, stunted growth, and generally miserable health. But even adults would have been regularly exposed. They sat on these floors, reclined on them when drunk, slept on them if they were too intoxicated to make it home. Every time they touched the floor and then touched food, their face, their mouth, they risked ingesting parasites or other pathogens. The floor also harboured insects. Fleas, lice, and other parasites lived in the organic matter of the floor coverings. Rats and mice nested in the rushes when spaces were unoccupied. These animals brought their own parasites and diseases. During winter, when people brought animals indoors, the line between animal bedding and human floor space became even more blurred. Animals would defecate where they stood. Their waste would mix with the floor rushes. People would walk through this, carry it on their shoes, spread it throughout the drinking area. Yet this was accepted as normal. Vikings didn't have an alternative. Truly washable floors, like modern tile or sealed wood, were centuries away from invention. The best they could do was periodically remove the worst of the rushes, scatter new ones, and accept that the floor would be perpetually contaminated with organic matter. It's hard not to think about this when you see film depictions of Vikings striding confidently across clean wooden floors, or when historical reenactors wear expensive leather boots on carefully maintained surfaces. The reality was walking through sodden, contaminated organic matter, and knowing that this was simply what floors were. Of course, this was just one aspect of the unhygienic conditions in Viking drinking spaces. Chapter 6. Winter. Drinking. The challenges of Viking Age. Drinking spaces intensify dramatically during winter. Scandinavia's harsh winter climate, months of darkness, temperatures well below freezing, howling winds and heavy snow, transformed already unpleasant drinking conditions into something far worse. Winter meant sealing the alehouse against the cold. Any ventilation openings that existed would be closed or covered to prevent precious heat from escaping. The smoke hole in the roof might be partially blocked to reduce heat loss. Windows, if they existed, would be shuttered. The result was a space with almost no air circulation whatsoever. Imagine being inside one of these winter alehouses. The central fire burns constantly, consuming wood that people have laboriously hauled and stored during warmer months. The heat is intense near the fire but doesn't distribute evenly. People close to the hearth sweat while those near the walls shiver. The air is thick, hot, smoky, and increasingly depleted of oxygen as dozens of people breathe in an enclosed space. The smell becomes even more overpowering in winter. All those odours we discussed, unwashed bodies, stale ale, vomit, animal waste, have nowhere to go. They concentrate, intensify, layer upon each other. The heat makes them stronger. Bacteria thrive in the warm, moist environment. Everything ferments, rots, and decays at an accelerated pace despite the outdoor cold. But what made winter drinking truly brutal was the danger that awaited when someone left. Walking home drunk in a Scandinavian winter was genuinely life-threatening. Temperatures could drop to -20 or 30 Celsius. Snowstorms reduced visibility to nothing. Paths disappeared under snow, and alcohol impaired judgment, reduced body temperature, and prevented people from recognizing when they were in danger. People froze to death, not occasionally, regularly. Archaeological evidence suggests this was common enough that Norse culture developed a specific term for it: ale death. This referred specifically to people who died from exposure while intoxicated, distinguishing it from other forms of death. Bodies would be found in spring when the snow melted, sometimes just outside the alehouse, mere metres from warmth and safety, where someone had stumbled drunkenly and passed out. Sometimes farther away, along paths home, where they'd wandered off course and succumbed to the cold. Sometimes they simply disappeared, buried under snow, perhaps carried away by animals during the long winter, leaving families to wonder what had happened. The sagas contain numerous references to people dying in winter after drinking, usually presented matter-of-factly rather than as exceptional tragedies. He went out after drinking and was not seen again is a common formulation. The casualness of these references suggests how normalised this kind of death had become. Yet people continue to drink heavily in winter, perhaps especially in winter. The long darkness, the confinement, the boredom of being trapped indoors for months, all of this made alcohol more appealing, not less. Winter was when stored grain was most plentiful, before the lean months of late winter and early spring. It was when social drinking provided one of the few entertainments available, so Vikings accepted the paradox. Drinking was most dangerous in winter, yet winter was when drinking felt most necessary. They accepted that some people would die of ale death each year, that this was simply part of life in a harsh climate. We can scarcely imagine making that calculation today, choosing to engage in an activity knowing that it might kill us on our way home. But for Vikings, the alternative was winter isolation, which carried its own psychological and social costs. Chapter 7. The Violence. Now we must address the violence that permeated Viking Age drinking spaces. This is perhaps the aspect of tavern culture that popular media gets closest to right. Yes, Vikings did fight in alehouses, but even here, the reality was darker and more disturbing than romanticised film depictions suggest. Vikings carried weapons as a matter of course. A free man would typically have at least a knife, if not a sword or axe. These weapons came into drinking spaces. There were no weapon checks at the door, no security guards confiscating potentially dangerous items. Armed people drinking in enclosed spaces was simply normal. The combination of alcohol, personal honour culture, and readily available weapons was predictably lethal. Arguments that might have remained verbal in a sober state escalated to violence. Disputes over seating, who had the right to sit in positions of honour, could turn deadly. Insults that impugned someone's courage, honesty, or family reputation demanded violent response. Picture a winter evening in a crowded alehouse. Men packed close together on benches, everyone drinking steadily, the air hot and close and smoky. Tensions that existed outside. Property disputes, family feuds, competition for status, all carried into this space. Alcohol lowered inhibitions, made slights feel more insulting, made violence seem like the only acceptable response. A fight might start over something trivial, someone taking another's seat, a perceived insult, an accusation of cheating at dice. Within seconds, knives would be drawn. In the dim, smoky light, with reflexes impaired by alcohol, fights were chaotic and brutal. People didn't fence elegantly as in films. They grappled, stabbed wildly, slashed at whatever they could reach. What made this truly brutal was the lethality of even minor wounds. In an age without antibiotics or proper medical care, a knife wound to the abdomen would likely cause death within days from infection and sepsis, even if it wasn't immediately fatal. Cuts that nicked major blood vessels could cause someone to bleed out before help arrived. Even survivors often lived with permanent disabilities from improperly healed wounds. Some scholars estimate that between 10 and 15% of adult male deaths in Viking Age Scandinavia involved a combination of alcohol and violence. This is a staggering figure. It suggests that roughly 1 in every 7 or 8 men died in alcohol-related violent incidents. Not accidents, not disease, not old age, violence specifically connected to drinking. The sagas document this repeatedly. Egil Skallagrimsson, one of the most famous saga heroes, killed a man in a tavern dispute over seating arrangements and poetry. The saga of the people of Laxadal describes multiple killings in drinking contexts. These accounts are presented not as exceptional events but as ordinary occurrences. There was a fight at the feast and men were killed. Women and children present during these fights were also at risk. Violence didn't stop just because non-combatants were nearby. Saga accounts mention women injured or killed during tavern brawls, though these deaths receive less narrative attention than those of men. There was no real recourse against this violence. No police to call, no emergency services. If someone attacked you in a drinking space, your options were to fight back, flee, or hope someone intervened. The legal system could potentially provide compensation after the fact, blood money paid to victims' families. But this required navigating complex legal proceedings and often resulted in ongoing feuds. So Vikings drank knowing that any evening at the alehouse might end in violence, that disputes could turn deadly in seconds, that alcohol-fueled fights were simply part of the social landscape. It's hard not to feel that our modern bar fights, however regrettable, are tame by comparison. Chapter 8. Women in Taverns. Let us now examine the women who worked in Viking Age drinking establishments, for their experiences reveal some of the darkest aspects of this culture. These women served ale, managed hospitality, and endured treatment that legal codes of the time barely acknowledged as wrong. Women who served ale fell into several categories. Some were wives or daughters of household heads who brewed and served as part of their domestic duties. Others were hired servants who worked for wealthier households that had developed reputations as drinking venues. but a significant number were enslaved women, thralls who had no choice in their labour or how they were treated. The work itself was physically demanding. Brewing required hauling water, often from wells or streams some distance from the house. Grain had to be processed, mashed, monitored. Serving meant carrying heavy vessels of ale repeatedly throughout the evening. The heat from fires and fermentation work was constant. Back injuries, burns and exhaustion were occupational hazards. But the physical labour was perhaps the least of their problems. Women serving in drinking spaces were expected to tolerate sexual harassment as a normal condition of their work. Men who were drunk felt entitled to grab, grope, make explicit comments, and proposition serving women with impunity. Picture a young woman, perhaps enslaved, perhaps free but poor, carrying ale through a crowded room full of drunk men. Hands reaching out to touch her as she passes. Comments about her body, her attractiveness, what men would like to do to her. Having to smile through this because showing anger or resistance could result in violence or punishment from her owner or employer. What made this truly brutal was that Viking Age legal codes explicitly devalued the testimony and rights of women in these positions. In Icelandic law, for example, the vergild, the compensation paid, for killing someone, was significantly lower for serving women than for free women of higher status. Their lives were literally assigned less value. Some legal texts suggest that sexual assault of serving women was not considered a serious crime if it was considered a crime at all. A thrall woman could be assaulted with minimal legal consequences for the perpetrator. Even free women of low status had limited legal recourse. The system essentially declared them fair game. Saga accounts contain references to violence against ale-serving women, usually mentioned in passing as background detail rather than as significant plot points. A woman is grabbed, assaulted, perhaps killed during a brawl, and the narrative moves on without dwelling on her suffering. The power dynamics were stark and inescapable. A woman serving ale was simultaneously necessary. The social function of the alehouse depended on her labour, and vulnerable. She had to maintain a careful balance, providing hospitality and tolerating certain behaviours while trying to avoid the worst abuse. But where exactly that line was depended entirely on the men present and their level of intoxication. For enslaved women, there was no escape from this. They served until they were too old or injured to work, or until they died. Their experiences in drinking spaces were just one aspect of the broader brutality of thraldom, but one that exposed them to violence from multiple men rather than just their owner. Even free women who brewed and served in their own households weren't immune. Their status provided some protection, but social pressure to be hospitable meant tolerating behaviours that modern women would never accept. So when we romanticise Viking feasting culture, we must remember that this culture was built partly on the forced labour and systematic abuse of women who had little power to resist, or even to have their suffering acknowledged as significant. This reminds us that history's social spaces often relied on the exploitation of the most vulnerable. Chapter 9. The Brewing Process. Let us return to the brewing process itself, examining it now in more detail to understand exactly how Viking ale was made, and why this process guaranteed contamination and inconsistency. Brewing began with water, and the quality of that water varied enormously. In rural areas, water might come from streams or rivers that also served as dumping grounds for waste, both human and animal. Town wells were theoretically cleaner but could easily become contaminated. There was no way to test water quality, no understanding of what made water safe or dangerous to use. This water had to be heated, a significant undertaking that required substantial fuel. Large quantities of wood had to be burned to heat enough water for a full brewing batch. In some areas, hot stones would be heated in fires and then dropped into water-filled troughs, causing violent boiling and steam. The stones themselves, pulled from fires, containing animal fat and other substances, would transfer flavours and contaminants into the water. The mashing process, mixing hot water with malted grain, happened in whatever large vessels were available. Wooden troughs were common. These might be carved from single logs, creating a container that could hold dozens of litres of liquid. But wood is porous and impossible to truly sanitize with Viking Age methods. Previous batches, previous uses of the vessel, all left microbial traces that would influence the current brew. Brewers stirred the mash with long wooden paddles or branches, working to extract sugars from the grain. This could take hours of physical labour, standing over hot steaming liquid, breathing in the vapour, maintaining constant motion. The resulting wort, the sugar-rich liquid extracted from grain, would then be strained through fabric or woven material to separate liquid from spent grain. What made this process truly problematic was the complete lack of temperature control. Vikings had no thermometers, no way to measure heat precisely. They judged temperature by touch, by experience, by guesswork. Too hot and you might kill wild yeasts. Too cool and fermentation might not start at all. The margin for error was narrow and entirely based on the skill and luck of the brewer. Fermentation occurred in open vessels, large wooden barrels, clay amphorae, any container that could hold liquid. These were exposed to air, to insects, to whatever microorganisms happened to be present. Vikings had observed that leaving sugary liquid in certain vessels would cause it to become alcoholic, and they understood that reusing successful vessels or adding some liquid from previous successful batches would help new batches ferment. But they didn't understand why this worked, or what was actually happening. Wild yeasts and bacteria in the air and on vessel surfaces would colonise the wort and begin consuming sugars, producing alcohol and various other compounds. Sometimes this process produced drinkable ale. Sometimes it produced something sour, bitter, or actively unpleasant. Sometimes contamination with the wrong bacteria would produce ale that made people sick. During warmer months, fermentation happened relatively quickly, perhaps 3 to 5 days. In winter, it could take much longer, requiring brewers to maintain warmth around fermentation vessels, further complicating the process. Some brewers added additional ingredients, herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, or heather, to add flavour and help preserve the ale. But some also added more dangerous substances. Henbane, a psychoactive plant, could increase the intoxicating effect of ale, but was also toxic in higher doses. There are references to strong ale that made people hallucinate or caused unusual symptoms, suggesting deliberate adulteration with mind-altering substances. The finished ale had to be stored, presenting yet another opportunity for contamination. Storage vessels were the same, wooden barrels and clay containers used for fermentation. Ale would slowly continue to change, becoming sourer over time as bacteria continued to work on any remaining sugars and the alcohol itself. There was no quality control, no safety standards, no way to ensure that the ale you drank today would be safe, even if the ale from the same brewer last week had been fine. Every batch was essentially an experiment. So when Vikings praised a good brewer, they were acknowledging not just skill, but consistency. The ability to repeatedly produce ale that was drinkable and relatively safe despite all the opportunities for contamination and failure. We can scarcely imagine consuming food or drink produced with so little control over safety and quality. Chapter 10. Child Presence. Now we must address an aspect of Viking drinking culture that is particularly disturbing to modern sensibilities. The presence of children in these spaces and their exposure to the full spectrum of alehouse behaviour. Viking Age homes and drinking spaces were not separated the way we separate adult spaces from family spaces today. Children lived in the same structures where heavy drinking occurred. They were present during feasts, during ordinary evening drinking, during all the behaviours we've been discussing. Violence, sexual harassment, extreme intoxication. Young children, toddlers and infants would be in the room when their parents and other adults drank. They breathed the same smoky air, were exposed to the same smells, witnessed the same disturbing behaviours. There was no concept of shielding children from adult activities. Childhood was not viewed as a period of innocence to be protected, but simply as a stage of incomplete development toward adulthood. Picture a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, crawling on the contaminated floor rushes we discussed earlier, putting small objects in their mouth, touching surfaces soaked with ale and worse. Meanwhile, nearby, adults are drinking heavily, fighting, vomiting, engaging in behaviour that would horrify modern parents if their children witnessed it. Older children, particularly girls, often worked in serving capacities. A daughter of the household might help carry ale, clear vessels, assist with brewing. This meant exposure to drunk adults, to their behaviours, to potential harassment or worse. Boys might be present as part of their social education, learning adult male behaviour by watching and participating. What made this truly brutal was that this environment contributed to child mortality in measurable ways. Archaeological evidence suggests that infant mortality was higher in households with active ale production. There are several possible explanations. Alcohol vapour exposure in poorly ventilated spaces could affect developing lungs and brains. Accidents were more likely when supervising adults were intoxicated. The generally unhygienic conditions of brewing and serving spaces exposed children to more pathogens. Children also consumed ale themselves, though typically small ale with minimal alcohol content. This was considered safer than water, and in many cases probably was, but it still meant that children were regularly consuming a mildly alcoholic beverage from a young age. The long-term health effects of this were never studied or understood. During violent incidents in drinking spaces, children were collateral victims. Saga accounts mention children injured in brawls, killed accidentally when fights spilled out of control. A child in the wrong place when weapons were drawn stood as much chance of being hurt as anyone else. The psychological impact of witnessing extreme violence and drunkenness from a young age can only be imagined. Modern psychology understands that children exposed to domestic violence and substance abuse suffer lasting trauma. Viking children had no such understanding, no therapy, no framework for processing what they witnessed. They simply absorbed it as normal, as the way the world worked. Yet this was accepted as simply part of raising children. You couldn't separate them from adult activities because there was no separate space for them. Your home was also your drinking venue, your workplace, your everything. Children were integrated into all of it, including its darkest aspects. Some children died in ways directly related to alehouse activities. Saga references exist to children drowning in brewing vats, burning in unattended fires while adults were drunk, wandering outside during feasts and freezing. These deaths were likely underreported in saga literature, which focused on notable people and events rather than everyday tragedies. So when we think about Viking childhood, we must remember that many children grew up in environments that modern child protective services would find appalling, and that this was simply normal, accepted, unremarkable to the people living it. This reminds us that our modern concern for child safety, our separation of adult spaces from family spaces, is a very recent development in human history. Chapter 11. Livestock Integration. We must now examine more closely the integration of animals into drinking spaces, for this created health hazards that compounded all the other unhygienic conditions we've been discussing. The boundary between human and animal space in Viking alehouses was not merely porous, it was often non-existent. During the warmer months, livestock typically remained outside in pens, pastures or barns. But Scandinavian winters were brutal enough to kill exposed animals. Horses, the most valuable livestock, would certainly be brought inside. Cattle might be as well, depending on their value and the severity of the cold. Pigs, chickens and other smaller animals moved indoors as a matter of course. These animals occupied the same structures where people drank. Sometimes there were interior partitions, wattle fencing, wooden barriers, creating nominal separation, but often, particularly in smaller or poorer households, animals simply shared the space. A drinking area might be 10 feet from a horse's stall, 15 feet from where pigs were penned. The smell we discussed earlier becomes even more understandable when you realise that people were drinking in what was essentially a barn. Fresh manure has a sharp, ammonia-rich smell that penetrates everything. Urine-soaked straw creates a pervasive wet animal odour. The heat from bodies and fires intensifies all of this. But the olfactory assault was the least of the problems. Animals defecating in close proximity to human activity meant constant contamination. People walked through animal waste, tracked it on their shoes, spread it to every surface they touched. The floor rushes in drinking areas would inevitably contain particles of animal feces, carried in on feet and blown about by movements through the space. What made this truly brutal was the parasitic burden it created. Animals host their own parasites, worms, flukes, various internal organisms that they shed in their feces. Many of these parasites can infect humans. The closer humans and animals live together, the more opportunity for cross-species transmission. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age remains, both human and animal, reveals shockingly high rates of parasitic infection. Roundworms, tapeworms, liver flukes, whipworms, Vikings carried an impressive array of internal parasites. Studies of preserved intestinal contents from well-preserved bodies show multiple species of parasites coexisting in single individuals. The transmission route is straightforward. Animal feces contains parasite eggs. Eggs contaminate surfaces and hands. Hands touch food or mouth. Eggs are ingested. Parasites develop in human host. In a space where animals and drinking occurred in close proximity, this cycle repeated constantly. Dogs were also present in alehouses, roaming freely, feeding on scraps, being fed by drunk patrons. Dogs in Viking Age Scandinavia were working animals. They hunted, herded, guarded, but they were also vectors for disease. They would defecate indoors in winter, would lick people and surfaces, would transfer bacteria and parasites from outside environments. Chickens presented their own hazards. They were often allowed to roam freely throughout structures, pecking at spilled grain and food scraps. Chicken feces is particularly rich in bacteria and parasites. Birds wandering through drinking spaces meant their waste ended up everywhere, on floors, benches, potentially even in food or ale if containers were left uncovered. Picture a winter feast scene with historical accuracy. The hall packed with people drinking, horses stamping in their section of the building, the warm smell of manure mixing with ale and smoke, chickens pecking around people's feet, dogs begging for scraps, everyone walking through a mixture of spilled ale and animal waste. This was the actual environment of Viking social drinking. Some scholars estimate that the disease burden from this livestock integration was substantial, possibly contributing to chronic illness in a majority of the population. People lived with intestinal parasites as a baseline condition, causing malnutrition, fatigue, digestive problems, and increased vulnerability to other diseases. Yet this integration was necessary for animal survival, and therefore for human survival. Letting valuable livestock freeze to death in winter was not an option. The economic loss would be catastrophic, so Vikings accepted the health consequences because the alternative was worse. We can scarcely imagine tolerating such conditions today, but for Vikings, separating human and animal spaces was simply not feasible given their climate and resources. Chapter 12. Ale Sickness. Let us now examine what Vikings called ale sickness, the immediate health consequences of consuming Viking Age ale. Modern hangovers are unpleasant, certainly, but they pale in comparison to the multi-day misery that could follow a night of Viking drinking. The alcohol itself was only part of the problem. Yes, Vikings could and did drink to the point of severe alcohol poisoning. Without any way to measure alcohol content, without understanding how intoxication worked, people sometimes simply drank themselves into dangerous states. Vomiting, unconsciousness, even death from alcohol alone were possible. But the contamination in ale created additional problems. bacterial contamination could cause gastrointestinal distress that had nothing to do with alcohol content. People might experience severe diarrhea, cramping, nausea that persisted for days. This wasn't a hangover in the modern sense. It was food poisoning, bacterial infection, consuming ale that had gone bad or been contaminated during production. Picture someone waking the morning after heavy drinking in a Viking alehouse. Their head pounds from dehydration and alcohol. But beyond the typical hangover, their stomach roils with bacterial infection from contaminated ale. They have severe diarrhea, particularly dangerous in winter when going outside to relieve yourself means exposure to brutal cold. They're deeply dehydrated but have only questionable water or more ale to drink. There was no understanding of hydration, no knowledge that alcohol dehydrates the body and that drinking water would help. The concept of electrolyte balance didn't exist. People suffering from ale sickness simply endured it, perhaps drinking more ale to numb the misery, creating a cycle of continued intoxication and illness. What made this truly disturbing was methanol poisoning. Fermentation, if it goes wrong, can produce methanol along with ethanol. Ethanol is the drinkable alcohol we're familiar with. Methanol is toxic, causing blindness, organ damage, and death. Vikings had no way to distinguish between ethanol-heavy and methanol-heavy ale, no way to test what they'd produced. Symptoms of methanol poisoning include severe headache, dizziness, confusion, and visual disturbances. In severe cases, permanent blindness or death could result. Medieval medical texts from slightly later periods describe symptoms consistent with methanol poisoning, following ale consumption. People going blind after drinking, people dying with mysterious symptoms after feasts. How often this happened is impossible to determine. Ale that was merely contaminated with bacteria would be much more common than ale with dangerous methanol levels. But the fact that methanol poisoning was possible, that no one could predict or prevent it, adds another layer of danger to Viking drinking. Some ale sickness was also allergic or sensitivity reactions. Unwashed fermentation vessels would accumulate complex mixtures of bacteria, yeasts, and moulds. People with sensitivities to any of these might experience reactions, rashes, respiratory problems, severe gastrointestinal distress, beyond what the alcohol itself would cause. The morning after experience could be genuinely debilitating. Yet people often had to work anyway. There was no calling in sick, no understanding employers. A labourer suffering from ale sickness still had to perform physically demanding work. A farmer still had to tend animals. A trader still had to conduct business. This created a miserable cycle. Work while sick from ale, drink again that evening to dull the remaining discomfort and the pain of hard labour, wake sick again. Some people probably lived in a near-constant state of low-grade alcohol intoxication and illness, never fully recovering before the next drinking session. Children exposed to ale vapour during brewing might experience similar symptoms, headaches, nausea, respiratory irritation, without having consumed any alcohol at all. The volatile compounds released during fermentation could cause illness in confined, poorly ventilated spaces. For enslaved people forced to work in ale production, chronic exposure to these conditions was unavoidable. They breathed fermentation vapours constantly, handled contaminated equipment, worked while suffering from the effects of vapour exposure, and had no ability to refuse or take time to recover. So, ale sickness was not a single condition, but rather a constellation of alcohol-related health problems that Vikings simply accepted as the cost of drinking. They had no medical interventions, no treatments, just endurance, and the hope that they'd recover before the next drinking occasion. It's hard not to feel grateful for modern quality control and safety standards that make such widespread suffering from drinking unusual rather than routine. Chapter 13. The Social Hierarchy. Now let us examine how social hierarchy was expressed and enforced in Viking drinking spaces. For these establishments were not egalitarian gathering places, but rather stages where status was performed and maintained through careful ritual. Seating position in a drinking hall was profoundly meaningful. The high seat, the position of greatest honour, was typically opposite the door, where the household head or most distinguished guest would sit. Proximity to the high seat indicated your status. The farther from the high seat, the lower your position in the social order. These arrangements were not casual. Everyone knew where they were supposed to sit. Sitting above your station, taking a seat closer to the high seat than your status warranted, was a serious insult to those of higher rank. It could provoke violent responses. Saga literature is full of accounts of fights starting over seating disputes, of men killing each other over who had the right to sit where. Picture the dynamics this created. People arriving at a drinking gathering, assessing who else was present, calculating their own position relative to others, negotiating for slightly better placement without overreaching. Every drinking occasion became a performance of social hierarchy, a reinforcement of who mattered and who didn't. The quality of ale served varied by status as well. The best ale, strongest, freshest, least contaminated, went to high-status individuals. Lower-status people drank weaker ale, ale from previous batches, ale that was starting to sour. The poorest labourers might drink small ale, the second or third running of water through already used grain, producing a barely alcoholic, nutritionally void liquid that existed more as safe hydration than as actual ale. This practice had a name in Old Norse poetry. Thrall's ale was used as an insult, suggesting someone was so low status they only deserved the dregs. The beverage you were served literally told you what your host thought of your social value. What made their system truly brutal was that it operated during every drinking occasion, from the grandest feast to an ordinary evening gathering. You could never escape the constant evaluation of your worth, the public demonstration of your place in the social order. For enslaved people, thralls, the hierarchy was even more extreme. They served but rarely drank, or drank only the worst quality ale. They stood while free people sat. They worked while others relaxed. The drinking space made visible their legal status as property rather than persons. Women's position in this hierarchy depended on their relationship to free men. A household mistress might occupy a position of honour, sitting near her husband in the high seat area. But serving women, as we discussed, occupied the lowest positions, necessary for the space to function but denied any status beyond their utility. The hierarchy even extended to how much people could drink. High-status individuals were expected to drink heavily as a display of their ability to provide and consume valuable resources. Lower-status people drinking too much could be seen as overstepping, taking more than their position warranted. Yet refusing to drink when offered could insult the host. This created impossible social calculations, particularly for people of ambiguous or middling status. Drink too much and you're presumptuous. Drink too little and you're insulting. Sit too high and you'll be challenged. Sit too low and you're demeaning yourself unnecessarily. The system also meant that those who could least afford the health consequences of heavy drinking, labourers who needed physical capability to work, people already malnourished, were sometimes pressured to drink heavily to demonstrate loyalty or participation, while those who could most afford moderate drinking, wealthy individuals with easier lives, were expected to drink to excess as status performance. Archaeological evidence supports this hierarchy. Analysis of skeletal remains shows that higher status individuals had slightly better health outcomes, despite often having evidence of heavier alcohol consumption. They had better nutrition to buffer alcohol's effects, better living conditions, more resources to recover from illness. Lower status people showed more signs of malnutrition, parasitic infection, and alcohol-related health problems. So drinking spaces were not escapes from social hierarchy, but rather theatres where hierarchy was enacted, reinforced, and occasionally violently defended. Every cup of ale, every seat, every interaction was laden with social meaning and potential for conflict. We can scarcely imagine navigating such fraught social territory just to have a drink. Chapter 14. Fire Hazards. Let us now consider the constant threat of fire in Viking drinking establishments, for fire was perhaps the most immediately lethal hazard these spaces contained. Everything about Viking Age construction and lifestyle created conditions for catastrophic fires, and alcohol made these conditions dramatically worse. Viking structures were made of wood, wattle and daub, and turf, all flammable materials. The roof, covered in dried sod and thatch, would burn readily once ignited. Interior spaces contained wooden beams, wooden furniture, straw or rushes on floors, fabric wall hangings in wealthier homes. The structure itself was essentially kindling. The central hearth, necessary for heat and light, was an open fire in the middle of the structure. No fireplace, no containment beyond perhaps a ring of stones. Sparks flew constantly. In winter, when fires burned larger and longer, the risk increased proportionately. Lighting came from additional fire sources: oil lamps burning animal fat, tallow candles, torches. All of these involved open flames. All could be knocked over, dropped, or set too close to flammable materials. And all of this happened in spaces where people were drinking heavily, where coordination was impaired, where judgment failed. Picture a crowded winter ale house, dozens of people packed together, all drinking, the air hot and close from the central fire and body heat. Someone stumbles, knocks over an oil lamp. The burning oil spreads across the floor, rushes soaked in ale and organic matter. Within seconds, flames race across the floor. The dried rushes catch immediately. The wooden benches begin to burn. Smoke fills the space faster than people can react. What made this truly brutal was that fires in drinking spaces often had high casualty rates. Drunken people react more slowly. They might not smell smoke as quickly, might not recognise danger as fast, might make poor decisions about escape routes. Some would be unconscious from intoxication and never wake. Others would be too impaired to navigate the smoke-filled darkness. Saga literature contains numerous references to people burning to death while drunk. Sometimes entire structures burned with everyone inside. The phrasing is often matter-of-fact. They were all burned inside appears in multiple sagas, describing the deaths of dozens or even hundreds of people in burning halls. Some of these fires were deliberate, acts of warfare or revenge where enemies barred the doors and set structures ablaze. But many were accidents. Fires started by carelessness, by drunken mistakes, by the inevitable consequence of open flames in enclosed wooden spaces full of intoxicated people. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age sites shows layers of burned material, evidence of catastrophic fires. Hedeby, one of the largest Viking towns, burned multiple times. Each fire destroyed sections of the town, killing unknown numbers of people. How many of these fires started in drinking contexts is impossible to determine, but given the prevalence of fire in drinking spaces and the risk factors involved, the number was certainly substantial. Individuals falling into fires was common enough to appear in legal codes. Various Norse law codes mention compensation to be paid when someone falls into a fire and dies or is injured. The fact that this required legal codification suggests it happened with enough frequency to need standardized legal responses. Picture someone drinking heavily near the central hearth, sitting on a bench close to the fire for warmth. They lean back, lose balance, fall backward into the flames. By the time others react, they've suffered serious burns. In an age without burn treatment beyond crude salves, without understanding of infection control, severe burns were often fatal. Death might come days later from infection and shock rather than immediately from the flames. Children were particularly vulnerable. They moved quickly, played near fires, lacked the judgment to recognise danger. When adults supervising them were drunk, accidents happened. Saga references to children burned in fires are rare. Children's deaths rarely merited detailed recording, but the silence itself is telling. These deaths were common enough to not be noteworthy. The winter months, when fires burned largest and people were most confined indoors, saw the highest fire risk. Yet this was also when people most needed warmth and light, when drinking was most prevalent. Vikings accepted this paradox. Fire was essential for survival, but also a constant threat to it. Fire suppression technology didn't exist. No fire extinguishers, no organised fire brigades, no water readily available in sufficient quantities to fight a major fire. Once a structure began burning, the best you could do was evacuate and let it burn, hoping it didn't spread to adjacent buildings. So Vikings lived with fire danger the way we might live with a dangerous wild animal in our homes, aware of the threat, taking basic precautions, but ultimately accepting that sometimes people would die this way. It's hard not to think about smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, and building codes as miraculous life-saving technologies rather than boring regulations. Chapter 15. Disease Transmission. Now we must address the role of Viking drinking spaces as vectors for epidemic disease, for these crowded, unsanitary establishments created perfect conditions for pathogens to spread rapidly through populations. Crowding alone created disease risk. Dozens of people in an enclosed space breathing recycled air, coughing and sneezing without covering their mouths, sharing vessels and food. All of this facilitated disease transmission. But Viking drinking culture made conditions even worse through specific practices that modern epidemiology would recognise as catastrophically dangerous. Shared drinking vessels, as we discussed earlier, transferred oral bacteria and respiratory pathogens directly from person to person. Someone with tuberculosis drinking from a horn and then passing it to the next person was essentially inoculating that person with their disease. TB was endemic in Viking Age Scandinavia. Skeletal analysis shows evidence of tuberculosis in a substantial percentage of remains examined. Picture the transmission chain. One person with active tuberculosis attends a drinking gathering. They cough into their hand, then handle shared vessels. They drink from horns that others will use. They breathe and talk in close proximity to others in the smoky, confined space. Within one evening, they have exposed dozens of people. Some percentage of those exposed will develop tuberculosis themselves and continue the chain. But tuberculosis was just one of many diseases spread in these contexts. Respiratory infections, what we'd now call colds and flu, spread rapidly in crowded drinking spaces. These might seem minor compared to TB, but in malnourished populations living in harsh conditions, respiratory infections could be lethal. They could develop into pneumonia, which had high mortality rates in an age without antibiotics. Oral diseases also spread through shared vessels. Oral bacteria causing tooth decay and gum infections would be transferred person to person. More seriously, infections causing abscesses could spread this way, introducing dangerous bacteria into new hosts. What made this truly brutal was that epidemic diseases, plague, smallpox, typhus, also used drinking spaces as transmission hubs. When plague reached Scandinavia in the 14th century, though this is after the Viking Age proper, taverns and drinking halls were death traps. The bubonic plague is primarily spread by fleas, but pneumonic plague, a lung infection version, spreads through respiratory droplets in exactly the conditions that drinking spaces created. Yet during plague outbreaks, people continued gathering to drink. Partly this was because they didn't understand disease transmission. The germ theory of disease was centuries away from discovery. But partly it was because Ali was still safer than water, because social bonds felt necessary during crisis, because humans faced with catastrophe often seek comfort in familiar rituals even when those rituals are dangerous. Historical records from later medieval periods describe drinking establishments as places where disease spread with terrifying speed. Whole groups would sicken within days of gathering together. Multiple family members would die in sequence after shared drinking occasions. The correlation between drinking gatherings and disease outbreaks was observed, but without understanding the mechanism, there was no effective intervention. Children and elderly people were most vulnerable. Children had less developed immune systems. Elderly people had weakened ones. Both were often present in drinking spaces, exposed to the same pathogens as healthy adults but less able to fight off infection. Immunocompromised individuals, people already sick with other conditions, people malnourished, people weakened by parasitic infections, were also at extreme risk. For them, exposure to common pathogens in drinking spaces could be lethal. A respiratory infection that would make a healthy person moderately sick for a week might kill someone whose body was already struggling with malnutrition and parasites. The seasonal pattern of disease outbreaks correlated with drinking patterns. Winter, when people crowded indoors and drank most heavily, saw the highest rates of respiratory illness. Spring, after months of immune system stress, saw elevated mortality. The drinking culture contributed to this cycle. Archaeological evidence shows periods of dramatically elevated mortality in urban areas with concentrated drinking establishments. Skeletal analysis from Birker and Hedeby reveals periods where death rates spiked, where burials suddenly increased, suggesting epidemic disease. While we can't definitively link these to drinking spaces, the correlation is suggestive. So drinking establishments served a dual role. They were social centres that humans needed for psychological and cultural reasons, but they were also disease incubators that killed substantial numbers of people. Vikings had no way to maintain the social function while mitigating the health risks. We can scarcely imagine accepting such trade-offs today, but for Vikings, the choice was between dangerous social connection and isolating solitude, and they chose connection, disease risks, and all. Chapter 16. The Alewife's Life. Let us now examine in more detail the daily existence of women who brewed and served ale professionally, for their lives reveal physical hardships that romanticised accounts of traditional women's work consistently overlook. Brewing was exhausting physical labour that began before dawn and continued throughout the day. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often at considerable distance from the brewing site. A single batch of ale might require hundreds of litres of water, all carried in buckets or vessels that weighed significantly when full. This alone was back-breaking work, made worse by repetition across multiple brewing days each week. Grain required processing before brewing could begin. Malting grain meant spreading it on floors to germinate, keeping it moist, turning it regularly, then drying it, often over fires that had to be maintained constantly. The smoke exposure from these drying fires was intense and prolonged. Women spent hours in smoky spaces, breathing air thick with particles that irritated lungs and eyes. The mashing process demanded constant physical effort. Wooden paddles stirred massive amounts of grain and hot water in large troughs. This required upper body strength and endurance, standing over steaming vessels for hours, maintaining constant motion. The heat was oppressive, the steam relentless. In winter this might provide welcome warmth, but in summer it was nearly unbearable. Lifting and moving vessels full of liquid required strength that smaller statured women often struggled to provide. A wooden barrel full of fermenting ale could weigh 50 kilograms or more. Moving these vessels, pouring from them, cleaning them, all created opportunities for injury. What made this work truly brutal was that it was in addition to, not instead of, other household labour. An alewife still had to prepare food, maintain the household, care for children, perform textile work. Brewing was an additional burden, not a specialised profession that freed her from other duties. She worked from before dawn until after dark, with no days off, no concept of reasonable working hours. The physical toll shows up in skeletal remains. Archaeological analysis of women's skeletons from households known to be involved in ale production reveals specific patterns of injury and degeneration. Spinal degradation, particularly in the lower back, was common, the result of years of lifting heavy loads and bending over brewing vessels. Arthritis in hands and wrists suggests repetitive strain from stirring and handling equipment. Stress fractures in feet and legs indicate prolonged standing and carrying heavy loads. Burns were another occupational hazard. working around constant fires, handling hot liquids, managing steaming vessels, all created opportunities for serious burns. In an age without effective burn treatment, severe burns could be disfiguring or fatal. Even minor burns, repeated frequently, would cause scarring and permanent damage. Respiratory problems likely plagued alewives as well. Constant smoke exposure, breathing fermentation vapours, working in poorly ventilated spaces, all would contribute to chronic lung irritation. Though we cannot directly observe respiratory damage in skeletal remains, comparative evidence from later periods suggests chronic respiratory disease was common in women who worked in brewing and other smoke-intensive occupations. The violence we discussed earlier affected alewives particularly severely. They had to navigate drunk men, tolerate harassment, and hope to avoid serious assault while continuing to work. Unlike patrons who could leave when tensions rose, alewives had to remain present, vulnerable to whatever behaviours emerged as drinking continued. Life expectancy data, though incomplete, suggests alewives had shorter lives than women in other occupations. The combination of physical exhaustion, injury, burn risks, violence exposure, and respiratory problems created cumulative health impacts that shortened lifespans measurably. For enslaved women working in ale production, conditions were even worse. They had no ability to refuse work when injured or sick, no recourse if burned or assaulted, no hope of stopping when their bodies gave out. They simply worked until they died or became too disabled to continue, at which point they were often abandoned or given the worst labour assignments. Yet brewing was considered low-status work despite its difficulty. The physical nature of the labour, the association with serving others, the connection to household rather than public sphere, all marked it as women's work and therefore less valuable. Men might profit from ale production, but women bore the physical cost. So when we romanticise traditional brewing, when we admire artisanal methods and ancestral practices, we must remember the broken backs, the burned hands, the shortened lives of the women who actually performed this labour. This reminds us that much of history's traditional women's work was brutal physical labour that destroyed bodies over time. Chapter 17. Bladder Problems. Now we must address a biological reality that Viking drinking culture created. The constant, urgent need to urinate, and the profound lack of infrastructure to accommodate this need. Ale was the primary beverage for most Vikings, consumed throughout the day. But ale is a diuretic. It causes the body to produce more urine. Someone drinking several litres of ale in an evening would need to urinate frequently and copiously. This basic biological fact, combined with Viking Age living conditions, created persistent discomfort and unsanitary conditions. There were no toilets in Viking Age drinking spaces, no plumbing, no dedicated facilities, no privacy. The options for dealing with the urgent need to urinate were limited and all unpleasant. In warmer months, people could step outside. This was the preferred option. Leave the drinking space, find a spot away from the structure, urinate and return. But away from the structure often meant just outside the door or around the nearest corner. There were no designated areas, no understanding that urine should be disposed of far from living spaces. The area immediately surrounding drinking establishments would reek of urine, the ground saturated with it. Picture the ground outside a popular alehouse in summer. Dozens or hundreds of people over weeks and months urinating in the same general area. The soil becomes chemically altered. Plants die from the nitrogen overload. The smell is overpowering. Flies breed in the contaminated soil. Dogs and other animals further foul the area. Yet this is where people walk, where they sit on summer evenings, where children play. Winter made outside urination significantly more unpleasant. Stepping outside meant exposure to brutal cold, often in the dark, usually while intoxicated. The shock of cold air on a warm, drunk body was jarring. But the alternative, Trying to urinate while clothed in bulky winter garments meant fumbling with multiple layers of clothing with impaired coordination in sub-zero temperatures. Some people, particularly women wearing multiple layers of clothing, simply couldn't manage the process quickly enough. By the time they'd removed enough clothing to urinate, they'd be dangerously cold. The result was that people, especially when already somewhat drunk, would postpone urination as long as possible, leading to extreme discomfort. What made this situation truly disturbing was that people sometimes simply urinated indoors rather than face the cold. Archaeological evidence supports this. Analysis of floor layers in Viking Age drinking areas has revealed chemical signatures consistent with urine, the nitrogen compounds, the specific pH changes that urine creates in soil. More direct evidence comes from parasitology studies. The presence of certain parasitic worm eggs in floor deposits suggests fecal contamination as well. These parasites require human waste to complete their life cycle. Their presence in floor layers means human feces ended up on drinking space floors, likely from people too drunk to go outside in winter. Picture the scenario. A man drinking heavily on a winter night, needing desperately to urinate but unwilling to face the brutal cold outside. He moves to a corner, turns his back for minimal privacy, and relieves himself against the wall or directly onto the floor rushes. The liquid soaks into the rushes, pools on the packed earth, creates a wet spot that others will step through. The smell adds to the already overwhelming olfactory assault. Women faced even worse choices. Their clothing and anatomy made discreet indoor urination nearly impossible. But going outside meant vulnerability. Drunk men, darkness, cold, the dangers of isolated spaces. So women often suffered in silence, holding their bladder to painful extremes, risking urinary tract infections from infrequent emptying. The high salt content of preserved foods exacerbated all of this. Salt-cured fish, preserved meats, cheese, all made people desperately thirsty. They drank more ale to quench that thirst, which made them need to urinate more, which made them drink more ale because they just lost fluid. It was a cycle that ensured people were either uncomfortable from bladder fullness or uncomfortable from dehydration, with no comfortable middle ground. Chronic bladder discomfort would have been a baseline condition for people who spent regular time in drinking spaces. The modern concept of being able to comfortably empty your bladder whenever needed, in a clean private space with sanitation, this would have seemed like impossible luxury to Vikings. Urinary tract infections, bladder infections and kidney problems would have been common, particularly in women. Holding urine for extended periods, exposure to cold, general unsanitary conditions, all contributed to chronic urinary system problems that caused pain, fever, and sometimes death if infection spread to kidneys. Yet there was no solution available. Building separate toilet facilities required resources most people lacked. Understanding that urine and waste should be disposed of far from living spaces required knowledge of disease transmission that wouldn't exist for centuries. So Vikings accepted chronic bladder discomfort, accepted urinating in conditions that we would find intolerable, accepted that their drinking spaces would reek of urine and that floors would be contaminated with it. It's hard not to feel profound gratitude for indoor plumbing and the privacy and dignity it provides. Chapter 18. The mentally ill now. We must examine the treatment of people with mental illnesses or intellectual disabilities in Viking drinking spaces, for their experiences reveal some of the cruelest aspects of this culture. Mental illness and intellectual disability were poorly understood in the Viking Age. The causes were attributed to supernatural forces, curses, or simply being touched by the gods. There was no framework for understanding these conditions as medical issues, no effective treatments, no compassion protocols. People with obvious mental illnesses or disabilities lived within their communities, for the most part. There were no institutions, no separate facilities. They were simply part of the social landscape, their conditions visible to everyone, their struggles public. This visibility extended into drinking spaces, where they might be present either because they lived in the household, hosting the drinking, or because they wandered in. The treatment these vulnerable people received varied enormously depending on individual circumstances. Some communities and families showed genuine care, protecting vulnerable members, ensuring they were fed and sheltered. But in drinking contexts, where alcohol lowered inhibitions and amplified cruelty, vulnerable people often became targets. Picture a person with an intellectual disability in a crowded alehouse. They might not understand social cues, might behave in ways others found strange or amusing. Drunk people, their empathy diminished by alcohol, might mock them, tease them, deliberately frighten them for entertainment. This wasn't occasional. Saga literature and legal texts suggest it was common enough to be unremarkable. What made this truly brutal was a practice mentioned in some legal texts: deliberately getting mentally disabled individuals drunk for entertainment. The person would be encouraged or forced to drink, their behaviour as they became intoxicated, providing amusement for others. They might not understand what was happening, might not be able to consent meaningfully, but the practice continued because it was considered funny. The dangers this created for vulnerable people were severe. Someone with an intellectual disability getting drunk in an unfamiliar place might not be able to find their way home. They might stumble into danger, fires, fights, severe cold. They might be robbed or assaulted with no ability to defend themselves or report what happened. Some legal cases survive mentioning injuries or deaths of mentally disabled individuals in drinking contexts. The compensation required was typically less than for a fully capable person, again suggesting that their lives were valued less by the legal system. The casualness with which these cases are recorded suggests this happened with some frequency. People with mental illnesses like what we'd now recognise as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder might experience worsening symptoms in crowded, chaotic drinking spaces. The noise, the smoke, the social stress, the potential consumption of alcohol, all could trigger episodes. In a culture that interpreted such episodes as supernatural possession or divine madness, the responses might range from fear to mockery to violence. There was no concept of accommodating disability or mental illness. If someone couldn't navigate the complex social protocols of drinking spaces, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't recognise danger, that was their problem, not the community's responsibility to address. Children with disabilities were particularly vulnerable. They might not understand the dangers of drinking spaces, fire, violence, sexual predators, but would be present anyway because their families had no alternative care options. The casualty rate among disabled children in Viking Age settlements was likely substantially higher than for typically developing children, though this rarely appears in historical records because disabled children's deaths weren't considered significant enough to document. Elderly people experiencing cognitive decline, what we'd now recognise as dementia or Alzheimer's disease, also struggled in drinking contexts. They might become confused, wander off, forget where they were. Drunk caregivers might not notice someone had wandered outside into the cold until it was too late. Yet some individuals with mental illnesses or disabilities apparently found some social acceptance in drinking spaces. Court jesters and entertainers sometimes included people with disabilities whose unusual behaviours were considered entertaining. This provided some social role and protection, but at the cost of being objectified and mocked. The fundamental issue was that Viking culture, like most pre-modern cultures, lacked any framework for understanding and accommodating neurological and psychological diversity. People were expected to conform to social norms or face consequences. Those who couldn't conform due to disability or illness were vulnerable to exploitation, mockery and harm. So when we romanticize Viking social culture, we must remember that it was a culture that often treated its most vulnerable members with casual cruelty, particularly in contexts where alcohol amplified the worst human impulses. This reminds us that our modern disability rights framework, imperfect as it is, represents a profound moral advancement over most of human history. Chapter 19. Seasonal Desperation. let us now examine the relationship between seasonal food scarcity and drinking patterns, for late winter created a desperate situation where alcohol consumption could become a matter of survival, or a contribution to death. The Viking calendar created predictable patterns of abundance and scarcity. Harvest occurred in late summer and early autumn, bringing relative plenty. Winter was initially manageable, as stored food was still plentiful. But by late winter, February-March, stored food supplies dwindled dangerously. This was the hunger gap, the lean months before spring could provide new food sources. Ale, because it was brewed from grain, represented stored calories. A litre of ale might contain 400–500 calories, similar to a substantial meal. When food was scarce, ale became not just a beverage but a calorie source. People literally drank their meals. Picture a late winter household. The grain stores nearly empty, preserved meats consumed, no fresh food available. But ale remains, brewed months earlier when grain was more plentiful. The family drinks ale for breakfast, for midday, for evening. It provides calories, reduces hunger pangs, and numbs the discomfort of being constantly underfed. But this created a dangerous situation. Ale provides calories but little nutritional value. No protein, minimal vitamins, nothing to truly sustain the body long term. People drinking heavily while malnourished were getting drunk on far less alcohol than usual. Their impaired livers struggled to process alcohol. Their brains, deprived of proper nutrition, were more vulnerable to alcohol's effects. What made this truly disturbing was that malnourished people drinking heavily would sometimes die from the combination. Not from starvation alone, not from alcohol alone, but from the synergistic effect. Their bodies, already struggling, simply couldn't cope with both stresses simultaneously. Death might come from alcohol poisoning that wouldn't have been lethal in a well-fed person, or from malnutrition that might have been survivable without alcohol's additional burden. Skeletal analysis reveals mortality spikes in late winter. Burial records from areas where they exist show increased death rates in February and March. The causes of death would have been multiple: malnutrition, disease, cold. But alcohol-related deaths contributed to these spikes. Injuries also increased in late winter. Malnourished people had slower reflexes, poorer judgment, less strength to prevent falls or accidents. Add alcohol to this already compromised state, and accidents became more frequent and more serious. Falls that might have resulted in bruises in well-fed individuals caused broken bones in the malnourished. Children were particularly vulnerable during the hunger gap. They needed calories for growth and development, but alcohol provided empty calories that filled stomachs without nourishing bodies. Children given small ale to fill their bellies during food shortages were being sustained in the short term, while suffering malnutrition in the long term. For enslaved people and the very poor, late winter was even more desperate. They had less stored food to begin with, less access to remaining supplies, less ability to buffer against shortages. Some probably died each late winter, their deaths unremarked except perhaps in archaeological evidence of elevated mortality. The social pressure to continue drinking even during scarcity was intense. Drinking was how social bonds were maintained, how agreements were sealed, how hospitality was performed. A household that stopped serving ale to guests because supplies were low risk to social damage. So households served ale even when doing so meant their own supplies would run out sooner. This created a tragic calculation. Use scarce grain to brew ale for social purposes, or conserve it for direct consumption to survive late winter. Communities made different choices, but all faced the fundamental dilemma of social needs versus survival needs. Some people essentially chose to drink themselves to death rather than face slow starvation. For elderly people, for those already weak or sick, heavy drinking during the hunger gap might have been a form of self-deliverance, choosing a drunken end over lingering decline. Saga references to old people going to feast with the gods after drinking might be euphemistic descriptions of this practice. The seasonal cycle of feast and famine meant that drinking patterns followed predictable rhythms: heavy drinking in autumn when ale was fresh and food plentiful, Moderate drinking through early winter, desperate drinking in a late winter, then reduced consumption in spring and summer when other beverages were available and work demanded, sobriety. So Vikings lived with a drinking culture that was deeply entangled with food security, where alcohol was simultaneously recreation, nutrition, and potential death sentence depending on the season and one's resources. It's hard not to think about food security as one of the most basic requirements for healthy drinking culture, something Vikings often lacked. Chapter 20. Tooth Decay. Now let us examine the dental nightmare created by Viking drinking culture. For ale consumption caused oral health problems that led to chronic pain, disfigurement, and sometimes death. Ale contains sugars, fermented sugars, residual unfermented sugars, complex carbohydrates that break down in the mouth. These sugars feed oral bacteria, which produce acids that attack tooth enamel. Heavy ale consumption meant constant sugar exposure, constant bacterial activity, constant acid erosion of teeth. Vikings had no concept of dental hygiene as we understand it. They didn't brush teeth with abrasive pastes. They didn't floss. They didn't understand the connection between oral bacteria and tooth decay. The best they might do was rinse their mouths with water, pick food from teeth with small sticks or their fingers, or chew on certain herbs that had mild antimicrobial properties. But these efforts were inadequate against the bacterial assault created by constant ale consumption. Picture the oral environment of a regular ale drinker, teeth constantly bathed in sugary liquid, bacterial colonies thriving in every crevice, acids continuously eroding enamel. Over years, this caused progressive damage. Cavities formed, deepened, eventually reaching the pulp of teeth where nerves lived. Once tooth decay reached that stage, the pain was excruciating. Dental pain is uniquely terrible, sharp, constant, impossible to ignore. A severe toothache makes eating, sleeping, and thinking difficult. Vikings suffering from advanced dental decay would have been in constant misery, and there was no effective pain relief available. Certain herbs might dull pain slightly, alcohol might numb it temporarily, but the underlying problem persisted. Archaeological analysis of Viking Age skulls reveals shockingly high rates of dental disease. Studies of well-preserved remains show that severe tooth decay, abscesses, and periodontal disease affected a majority of adult skulls examined. Some skulls show evidence of dental disease affecting nearly every tooth. What made this truly brutal was that dental infections could be lethal. An abscessed tooth, when infection developed at the root, creating a pus-filled pocket, could spread that infection to surrounding tissues. The jaw could become infected, swelling dramatically, causing difficulty eating and breathing. Infection could spread through the bloodstream, causing sepsis and death. Some skulls show evidence of massive jaw infections, visible as holes eroded through the bone where infection destroyed tissue. These infections would have been agonizingly painful and often fatal. The person would have suffered for weeks or months as the infection slowly consumed their jaw. Comparative analysis is particularly revealing. Skulls from areas with heavy concentrations of ale-serving establishments show worse dental health than skulls from areas with less concentrated drinking infrastructure. This correlation suggests that heavy ale consumption, particularly in urban drinking establishments, was a significant contributor to poor oral health. Lost teeth created further problems. Without teeth, eating became difficult, limiting dietary options to soft foods. Malnutrition followed, creating a downward spiral where poor oral health led to poor nutrition, which led to worse overall health. People who had lost multiple teeth would have looked older than their years. Their faces collapsed where teeth had been. The social impact of severe dental disease is hard to measure but likely substantial. Bad breath from rotting teeth and infected gums would have been overpowering. The smell of dental infection is unmistakably foul, sweet, rotten, nauseating. Someone with severe dental disease would have carried this smell constantly. For alewives and others whose work required close interaction with many people, dental disease was an occupational hazard. Constant exposure to ale, combined with the stress and malnutrition of hard labour, created ideal conditions for rapid dental decay. Children raised in households with heavy ale production and consumption showed early dental disease. Even the weak small ale they drank contained enough sugar to damage developing teeth. Archaeological evidence shows dental decay in Viking Age children as young as 5 or 6. Yet dental disease was so common that it was simply accepted as a normal part of aging. People expected to lose teeth, expected dental pain, expected that their mouths would eventually become infected and diseased. There was no concept that this could be prevented, no understanding that dietary choices affected oral health. Some particularly wealthy or desperate individuals might have had rotten teeth physically extracted, pulled out with crude tools, with no anaesthesia beyond alcohol, the procedure itself agonising and likely to cause further infection. But this was a last resort, not a routine solution. So Vikings drank knowing that it would eventually destroy their teeth, cause them years of pain, potentially kill them through infection. But ale was necessary, for hydration, for calories, for social participation. They simply accepted the dental cost as unavoidable. It's hard not to feel grateful for toothbrushes, fluoride and dentistry every time we see a film depicting Vikings with perfect white teeth. Chapter 21. The Oldest Drinkers. Let us now turn our attention to elderly people in Viking drinking spaces, for their experiences reveal both the vulnerability of aging in harsh conditions and the limited agency available to those facing inevitable decline. Old age in the Viking Age was rare. Most people died young from disease, injury, childbirth, violence. Making it to 50 was an achievement. Reaching 60 or beyond was exceptional. Those who did survive to old age had endured everything we've been discussing. The disease, the malnutrition, the violence, the brutal conditions. They were survivors by definition. But survival into old age brought its own problems. Bodies weakened, teeth fell out, making eating difficult. Vision and hearing declined. Joints ached from decades of hard labour. The chronic parasitic infections, the accumulated injuries, the respiratory damage from years of smoke exposure. All of this created a diminished physical state. For elderly people, drinking spaces served multiple functions. Socially, they were places to maintain status and connection. An old man who had been a warrior or successful farmer could still hold court in drinking halls, could still be treated with respect, could still participate in the community through storytelling and advice giving. The drinking hall was one of the few places where physical capability mattered less than experience and social capital. But elderly bodies processed alcohol differently. Reduced liver function meant slower alcohol metabolism. Dehydration was more dangerous. Falls caused more serious injuries. An elderly person drinking the same amount as a younger person would become more intoxicated and suffer worse consequences. Picture an old man in his 60s, ancient by Viking standards, sitting in a winter alehouse. His hands shake from age and cold. His remaining teeth ache constantly. His lungs rattle from decades of smoke exposure. But he drinks because this is one of the few pleasures left to him, one of the few social contexts where he still has value. What made the situation of elderly drinkers truly complex was that some apparently chose to end their lives through drinking. Saga literature contains suggestive references to old people going to feast with the gods after heavy drinking sessions. Some scholars interpret these as euphemistic descriptions of essentially drinking oneself to death, a form of self-deliverance when faced with the prospect of slow decline into complete dependency. In a culture that valued self-sufficiency and feared becoming a burden, in an environment where survival required constant labour, complete physical decline was terrifying. An elderly person who could no longer work, who needed constant care, who consumed resources without producing anything, this was a precarious social position. Choosing to drink heavily until death came, whether from alcohol poisoning, from falling unconscious in the cold, or from some combination of factors, might have seemed preferable to lingering dependency. This wasn't suicide in the modern sense. It was more like accepting death rather than fighting desperately to delay it. The sagas treat these deaths with a certain dignity. An old warrior drinking himself to death while recounting past glories was presented as a noble end, better than dying sick and weak in bed. Whether this represents actual historical practice or saga idealization is debatable, but the pattern appears frequently enough to suggest some cultural acceptance of this path. For elderly women, drinking spaces were more complex. Older women who had survived childbearing years and retained status through family connections might participate in drinking culture as hosts or honoured guests. But elderly women without family support, particularly widows without sons, had precarious positions. They might be present in drinking spaces, but without the respect afforded to old men. The physical dangers of drinking increased with age. An elderly person falling while drunk was more likely to break bones. Hip fractures, which are survivable with modern medicine, were often death sentences in the Viking Age. The person would become completely immobile, unable to care for themselves, and would typically die within weeks from complications. Cold exposure was also more dangerous. Elderly people had less effective temperature regulation, less body mass to retain heat. An old person who wandered outside drunk in winter was at extreme risk. Yet the social pressure to participate in drinking culture persisted even in old age. Some elderly people apparently increased their drinking as they aged, using alcohol to manage chronic pain, to dull the awareness of decline, to maintain some connection to social life. This created a cycle where drinking caused more health problems, which led to more drinking to manage those problems. Archaeological evidence provides some support for these patterns. Analysis of skeletal remains suggests that some individuals who survived to old age showed evidence of heavy alcohol consumption, liver damage visible in bone chemistry, patterns of injury consistent with intoxicated falls, dental disease from decades of ale consumption. Yet elderly people were also valued in Viking culture as carriers of memory, tradition and wisdom. The same drinking spaces that endangered them also provided platforms for them to maintain social relevance. This created a tragic tension between the social benefits and physical risks of continued participation in drinking culture. So elderly Vikings faced a choice between social isolation or continued participation in drinking culture that their bodies could barely tolerate. Many apparently chose participation, accepting the risks because the alternative, lonely decline into irrelevance, seemed worse. It's hard not to reflect on our modern approaches to elder care, imperfect as they are, and recognise that we've at least created alternatives to this stark choice. Chapter 22. Ale Debts. Now we must examine the credit system for alcohol and its devastating consequences, for debt created through drinking could destroy lives and liberty in Viking Age society. Ale was valuable. It required grain, time, skill, and labour to produce. In a society operating partially on barter and partially on various forms of credit, people often consumed ale before paying for it, with the expectation that payment would come later, in goods, in labour, or in silver. Tally sticks were commonly used to track these debts. Wooden sticks would be notched to represent quantities owed, then split lengthwise so that both creditor and debtor had matching halves. This system worked reasonably well for honest participants, but was vulnerable to manipulation and dispute. Picture someone drinking regularly at an alehouse over the course of a winter. Each evening they consume ale. The tally stick accumulates more notches. They intend to pay when spring comes and they can work again, when they can trade goods, when circumstances improve. But winter is long, drinking provides comfort, and the debt grows steadily. Come spring, the debt might be substantial, equivalent to weeks or months of labour, more than the debtor can reasonably pay given their resources and other obligations. The creditor demands payment. The debtor cannot pay. What happens next reveals some of the darkest aspects of Viking social structure. What made this system truly brutal was that unpaid debt could result in enslavement. Viking Age law codes explicitly allowed for debt bondage. A person who could not pay their debts could be forced into thraldom, into legal slavery to work off what they owed. This wasn't a temporary situation that ended when the debt was repaid. Once enslaved for debt, a person might remain in that condition indefinitely, might be sold to others, might never regain freedom. Archaeological and legal evidence suggests this was not rare. Multiple Icelandic legal texts mention debt slavery. Saga accounts describe people becoming thralls due to inability to pay obligations. The system seems to have been relatively common, particularly for people of marginal economic status. Think about what this meant in the context of drinking culture. A poor labourer drinks through the winter, accumulates debt, cannot pay in spring, and becomes enslaved. His wife and children might also fall into dependency or poverty. His descendants might be born into slavery, all because he drank ale he couldn't afford, in a culture where refusing to drink was socially unacceptable. The social pressure to participate in drinking culture made avoiding debt difficult. If you were invited to drink and you refused repeatedly, you risked offence, social ostracism, loss of business opportunities. But if you accepted and couldn't pay, you risked enslavement. The choice was between social death and potential literal bondage. Creditors had incentive to encourage debt. An enslaved debtor was valuable property. They provided labour for life, could be sold, could reproduce to create more thralls. So ale providers might extend credit readily, knowing that non-payment would result in acquiring a slave. This created a predatory dynamic in some drinking establishments. People of marginal means would be welcomed, encouraged to drink, offered easy credit, and then crushed when payment came due. The system essentially converted poor free people into slaves through the mechanism of alcohol debt. For young men, this was particularly dangerous. They might drink to prove manhood, to participate in warrior culture, to gain social status. But without significant resources, they were vulnerable to debt accumulation. Some probably moved from free youth to enslaved adulthood through drinking-related debt. Women could also fall into debt slavery through drinking culture, though less commonly as direct drinkers. A widow who tried to maintain a household by serving ale might accumulate debts for supplies, for grain, for equipment. If her ale business failed and debts remained, she could be enslaved along with any children. The legal cases that survive mentioning debt slavery are probably a tiny fraction of actual instances. Most such transactions would have been handled at local things, assemblies, without written record, or through private agreements between creditor and debtor that never entered legal record at all. Some debtors might have chosen to flee rather than face enslavement, leaving their community, travelling to new areas where their debts weren't known. But this meant abandoning family, property, social connections, and risking death from the many dangers of travel in the Viking Age. The system also created complex social dynamics around drinking. Wealthy people could drink freely, knowing they'd never face debt slavery. They had resources to pay. Poor people had to calculate carefully, had to navigate the tension between social expectations and economic survival. Middle status people might drink cautiously, aware they could fall into debt, but also aware that refusing to drink damaged their social position. So the drinking culture was not just unhygienic or dangerous in the immediate sense. It was also a mechanism of social control and class stratification, a way that the poor could be converted into property through the socially necessary act of drinking. This reminds us that much of history's social culture was built on systems of exploitation that modern audiences rarely consider. Chapter 23. Religious Drinking. Let us now examine the role of alcohol in Viking religious practice. For the sacred dimension of drinking culture created pressures and dangers beyond the merely social. Norse religion incorporated alcohol extensively into ritual practice. Offerings to gods often involved pouring ale onto altars, into sacred spaces, or onto the ground at outdoor worship sites. Drinking toasts to specific gods was a central element of religious feasts. The act of drinking was not merely permitted in religious contexts, it was required, commanded, an essential element of proper worship. The blot, the Norse sacrificial feast, involved ritualized drinking on a grand scale. Animals would be sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on altars and participants, and then massive quantities of ale would be consumed in honour of the gods. These weren't modest ceremonies. Saga description suggests days-long feasts with essentially continuous drinking. Picture a major blot at a wealthy farm or chieftain's hall. Dozens or hundreds of people gathered, animals sacrificed, ale flowing freely. Everyone present is expected to drink, to participate fully in honouring the gods. Refusing would be not just socially unacceptable, but religiously offensive. You drank because the gods demanded it, because communal worship required it, because refusing suggested you didn't honour the gods properly. What made this truly brutal was that some religious ceremonies apparently required drinking to the point of unconsciousness, as proof of devotion. Several sources describe participants drinking until they passed out, with this state of complete intoxication viewed as a form of communion with the divine, a way to transcend normal consciousness and touch the sacred realm. Adam of Bremen, an 11th century Christian chronicler describing the pagan temple at Uppsala, mentions 9-day festivals where excessive drinking was mandatory, where participants became so intoxicated they could barely function. While Adam was writing from a Christian perspective and might have exaggerated, the core claim that pagan religious festivals involved extreme drinking appears in multiple sources. The religious dimension created unique dangers. Someone drinking for social reasons might stop when they felt sick or overly intoxicated. But someone drinking for religious reasons had additional pressure to continue, to prove their devotion, to not fail in their obligations to the gods. Death during religious drinking ceremonies would have carried complex meaning. On one hand, dying while honouring the gods might have been seen as honourable, even enviable. On the other hand, dying from excessive drinking during a ceremony you were hosting would reflect poorly on your ability to provide appropriate hospitality. Some scholars argue that certain psychoactive substances were added to religious ceremonial drinks to enhance the transcendent experience. Henbane, fly agaric mushrooms, or other consciousness-altering plants might have been mixed with ale for specific rituals. This would explain references to ritual drinks that caused unusual effects, hallucinations, altered perceptions, religious visions. But adding psychoactive substances to drinks created additional dangers. Dosing would be imprecise, individual responses varied, and toxic doses were probably not far above effective doses. Someone consuming ritual ale spiked with henbane or mushrooms might experience profound spiritual visions, or they might simply die from overdose. The funeral feast, the Iarephias, also involved ritualized heavy drinking. After someone's death, particularly a person of status, a feast would be held where participants drank to honour the deceased and to seal inheritance transfers. The heir couldn't fully assume their inheritance until the Arfi had been properly performed, meaning the drinking ceremony had legal significance. Think about the pressure this created. You needed to drink heavily enough to honour the dead properly, but if you drank so much you became incapacitated or offensive, you dishonoured both the deceased and yourself. The balance required navigating intense social and religious expectations, while becoming progressively more intoxicated. Seasonal festivals tied to agricultural cycles involve communal drinking as essential ritual elements. The winter solstice celebrations, harvest feasts, spring planting ceremonies, all incorporated ale consumption as religious obligation. For communities, this meant periodic massive drinking events were mandated by a religious calendar. Women had complex roles in religious drinking. Some served as priestesses or ritual specialists who would consecrate ale, perform blessings, and manage ceremonial drinking. But they were also expected to drink alongside men during major ceremonies, facing the same pressures to prove devotion through consumption. The conversion to Christianity didn't immediately end these practices. Even as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, many communities retained pagan drinking rituals, sometimes hybridizing them with Christian practices. The church eventually worked to separate alcohol from religious ceremony, but this took generations. So Viking drinking culture was not merely social or recreational, it was deeply entangled with religious obligation. People drank in part because they believed the gods demanded it, because communal worship required it, because refusing meant religious failure. This reminds us that throughout history, religion and intoxication have been frequently intertwined, often with dangerous results. Chapter 24. Summer Flies. Now we must address a problem that intensified during warmer months: the insect infestations that plagued Viking drinking spaces and the diseases they carried and spread. Winter had its own problems, as we've discussed, but summer brought insects. Flies were attracted to everything that made drinking spaces unsanitary: the spilled ale, the rotting floor rushes, the animal waste, the food scraps, the human waste. During summer months, drinking establishments would have been thick with flies. Houseflies breed in organic matter, manure, rotting food, decomposing plant material. The floor conditions we described earlier provided perfect breeding grounds. A single summer could see multiple generations of flies developing, their populations exploding as temperatures rose and breeding conditions improved. Picture a summer afternoon in a drinking space, the air warm and close, ale being served, food being consumed, and hundreds or thousands of flies buzzing throughout the space. They land on ale, vessels, on food, on people's faces and hands. They walk across surfaces, transferring bacteria from rotting matter to drinking vessels to food. Every surface is contaminated by fly feet that have just walked through animal feces or rotting organic matter. Flies are remarkably effective disease vectors. They carry bacteria on their feet and bodies: E. coli, salmonella, various pathogens that cause dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases. When flies land on food or drink, they often regurgitate slightly to help break down food for consumption, transferring their gut bacteria to whatever surface they have landed on. What made this truly disturbing was that flies laid eggs in food and drink if given the opportunity. A container of ale left uncovered for even a short period could become a fly breeding site. Adult flies would lay eggs, which would hatch into maggots within hours in warm conditions. These maggots would develop in the ale, feeding on the organic matter. In murky, opaque Viking ale, small maggots would be invisible. Someone drinking from a contaminated container might consume fly larvae without realizing it. Once ingested, fly larvae could potentially cause intestinal myiasis, a condition where fly larvae develop in the digestive tract. This could cause severe abdominal pain, nausea, and intestinal damage. How common intestinal myiasis actually was in Viking Age Scandinavia is impossible to determine with certainty. But the conditions for it certainly existed: uncovered food and drink, abundant flies, no understanding of the connection between fly contamination and illness. Medieval medical texts from later periods describe symptoms consistent with intestinal myiasis, suggesting it was known to medical practitioners. Beyond flies, other insects plagued drinking spaces. Wasps were attracted to sweet ale, particularly late in summer when natural food sources declined. Wasps in drinking vessels were dangerous. Someone drinking without looking might be stung in the mouth or throat, which could cause severe swelling and potentially fatal airway obstruction. Mosquitoes in Scandinavia could be abundant in areas near water or marshland. While Scandinavia didn't have malaria during the Viking Age, mosquitoes could still cause misery and spread other diseases. People drinking outside on summer evenings would have been constantly bothered by mosquitoes. Stored grain for brewing attracted grain beetles, weevils, and other insects. These would end up in the ale during brewing. Small insects or insect parts would be impossible to filter out completely. Everyone drinking ale regularly was consuming some quantity of insect material. Extra protein, though hardly appealing when you think about it. Fleas and lice, while not seasonal in the same way, proliferated more rapidly in warmer months. Drinking spaces with their organic floor coverings harboured flea populations. These didn't just cause itching. Fleas can transmit diseases like typhus and, historically, bubonic plague. The heat of summer also meant that contaminated ale would spoil more quickly. Bacterial growth accelerated in warm conditions. Ale that might have remained drinkable for a week in winter would sour within days in summer. This meant summer drinkers were more likely to consume ale that was actively fermenting in unhealthy directions, growing dangerous bacteria. There was no effective way to combat insect problems. Smoke might discourage some insects temporarily, but maintaining enough smoke to keep flies away would make the space unbearable for humans. Covering everything wasn't practical. People needed access to ale vessels, food, surfaces. Screening windows didn't exist, so Vikings simply accepted that summer drinking meant dealing with flies, with contaminated ale, with the constant presence of insects. They swatted, they picked flies out of their ale, they consumed whatever insect material ended up in their drinks. Some herbs had mild insect repellent properties. Certain aromatic plants could discourage flies somewhat, but these were marginally effective at best, offering minor relief rather than actual solutions. The medieval medical understanding of disease didn't connect insects to illness transmission. Flies were unpleasant, but not understood as dangerous. The idea that tiny organisms could cause disease simply didn't exist. So there was no motivation to solve the insect problem beyond the basic discomfort they caused. So summer drinking meant accepting insect contamination as an unavoidable aspect of the experience, consuming ale that flies had walked through and laid eggs in, and hoping your body could handle whatever pathogens came along with it. It's hard not to feel grateful for screens, for refrigeration, for food safety regulations that keep insects out of our beverages. Chapter 25. The Morning After. Let us close our examination of Viking taverns by considering what happened after a night of heavy drinking. The morning after, when consequences had to be faced and life had to continue despite the misery. The immediate physical state following a night of Viking drinking would have been brutal. Dehydration from alcohol consumption, combined with likely sleep deprivation from spending the night in an uncomfortable, noisy drinking space. If you'd passed out on the floor, you'd wake with your body aching from lying on hard-packed earth or wooden planks, possibly partially frozen if this was winter. Picture waking in the dim morning light filtering through smoke holes in the roof, your head pounding, mouth desperately dry, stomach roiling with nausea. Your clothing is soaked with spilled ale, possibly vomit, possibly urine if you lost control during the night. The smell of the space, which was overwhelming even when you were sober, is now nauseating. You need to urinate desperately, but the thought of standing makes your head spin worse. Around you, others are in similar states, some still unconscious, some vomiting, some stumbling outside. There's no sympathy, no accommodation for hangovers. If you have work to do, and most people did, you're expected to do it regardless of how you feel. For labourers, this meant performing physically demanding work while severely impaired. A farmer needed to tend animals, repair equipment, work fields, all with a hangover that made moving difficult and thinking nearly impossible. A fisherman needed to go out on boats, despite nausea and dizziness that made seasickness inevitable. A craftsman needed to perform detailed work with hands that shook and eyes that couldn't focus properly. The workplace accidents this caused were probably substantial. Someone working with axes, knives, or other dangerous tools while hungover was significantly more likely to injure themselves or others. Falls from heights, mistakes in judgment, slowed reaction times, all contributed to injury rates. What made this situation truly brutal was the cumulative effect. Many people probably never fully recovered from one drinking session before the next. Chronic low-level alcohol intoxication, combined with perpetual hangovers, would have been a baseline state for people who drank regularly. Their bodies never had time to fully repair, their livers never got a break, their brains never completely cleared. The long-term health consequences of this pattern were severe. Liver damage accumulated over years until liver function seriously degraded. Cognitive function declined from repeated alcohol exposure. Cardiovascular problems developed. The life expectancy impact of heavy regular drinking would have been substantial, though Vikings had no way to quantify it. For women who had served through the evening, morning brought no respite. The space needed to be cleaned, or at least cleared of the worst debris. Vomit needed to be dealt with, vessels collected and rinsed, some attempt made to make the space functional again. This work had to be done while the women themselves were likely exhausted and possibly hungover. Children waking in households after heavy drinking would face absent or impaired parents. A parent too hungover to properly supervise meant children were at greater risk of accidents, of going unfed, of being neglected. The cycle of drinking-related child neglect probably contributed to child mortality and poor child health outcomes. Injuries sustained during the previous night's drinking had to be dealt with in the morning. Someone with a knife wound from a fight, someone with burns from falling near the fire, someone with broken bones from a drunken fall. These injuries became apparent in morning light and needed attention. But medical care was limited and often ineffective. Wounds might be washed, certainly, and perhaps bound with fabric. Herbal remedies might be applied. But there were no antibiotics, no pain management beyond more alcohol, no way to prevent infection or promote proper healing. Many injuries that would be minor with modern medical care became serious or fatal. The social consequences of the previous night also had to be faced in the morning. Insults exchanged while drunk might spark feuds. Property damage had to be addressed. If someone had died in the night, from violence, from alcohol poisoning, from exposure, their body had to be dealt with and legal proceedings begun. For enslaved people who had worked serving during drinking sessions, mourning often brought more labour with even less rest than free people received. They cleaned, they prepared for the next evening, they performed whatever other work was demanded, all without the option to refuse or rest. Some scholars estimate that alcohol-impaired work accidents contributed significantly to overall disability and death rates in Viking Age Scandinavia. People working while still drunk from the night before, or working while severely hungover, were involved in accidents at rates substantially higher than sober workers. Falls, tool injuries, drownings, exposure, all increased when people tried to work while impaired. Yet there was no alternative. Taking days off to recover from hangovers wasn't an option for most people. Work had to be done, obligations had to be met, survival required continuous labour. So Vikings worked through the misery, accepted it as the cost of drinking, and likely drank again that evening to dull the pain of the day's labour. The cycle repeated endlessly. Drink heavily, wake miserable, work while impaired, drink again. For many Vikings, this was simply life. There was no drinking culture separate from regular existence, just a constant presence of alcohol and its consequences woven through every aspect of daily experience. So when we romanticize Viking feasting and drinking, we must remember the morning after, the pain, the impairment, the accidents, the cumulative damage to bodies that had no chance to fully recover. The glory of the feast never extended to the grim reality of the following day. This reminds us that our modern understanding of alcohol's effects, our ability to moderate, our option to take time to recover, these are privileges that most of history lacked, and so we've reached the end of our exploration of Viking Age drinking establishments. We've spent the last 2.5 hours examining every uncomfortable detail, from the physical structures themselves to the contaminated ale they served, from the shared vessels that spread disease to the floors soaked with organic matter. We've looked at the violence, the fire hazards, the parasites, the dental decay. We've considered the vulnerable people who suffered most in these spaces, the women who served, the children who were present, the elderly and disabled who had little protection. What emerges from this exhaustive examination is a picture radically different from popular culture's Viking tavern. There were no clean wooden tables, No attractive servers with perfect teeth. No jolly atmosphere of uncomplicated merriment. Instead, there was smoke and darkness, the smell of unwashed bodies and animal waste, the constant presence of disease and danger. These were spaces where people drank because they had to, because ale was safer than water, because social participation required it, because religious observance demanded it. They were spaces where the simple act of getting drunk could lead to freezing to death on the way home, to being killed in a fight, to debt slavery, to any number of grim fates. The Vikings who gathered in these establishments weren't ignorant or foolish. They were people making the best choices available to them with the knowledge and resources they had. They couldn't have understood germ theory, couldn't have prevented parasitic infections, couldn't have created the sanitation infrastructure that makes modern drinking spaces relatively safe. They did what they could and accepted what they couldn't change. But understanding their constraints doesn't require us to romanticize their reality. The Viking Tavern was filthy, dangerous, and disease-ridden. It was a place where survival and social participation required accepting conditions that would horrify us today. And yet, this examination raises larger questions about drinking culture across history, about the gap between how we imagine the past and how people actually lived. Every romanticized historical drinking space, medieval taverns, Wild West saloons, prohibition speakeasies, had similar dark realities that popular culture prefers to ignore. Consider for a moment the invisible infrastructure that makes modern drinking spaces relatively safe. Health codes that require separation of food preparation from restrooms, plumbing that removes waste efficiently, ventilation systems that clear air, fire suppression technology, building codes that prevent catastrophic fires, food safety regulations that ensure beverages aren't contaminated, labour laws that provide some protection to servers, disability rights frameworks that limit exploitation of vulnerable people. None of this existed in the Viking Age. All of it had to be invented, fought for, implemented through centuries of gradual progress. Every building code regulation, every health inspection, every safety standard represents lessons learned, often through tragedy, through disease outbreaks, through deaths that might have been prevented. When we walk into a bar today, we don't think about any of this. We assume the drink won't poison us, that the glass is clean, that we won't freeze to death on the way home, that violence will be limited and met with legal consequences. We assume floors that don't harbour parasites, air we can breathe without choking on smoke, the option to use clean restrooms rather than urinating in corners. These assumptions represent accumulated centuries of public health knowledge, of infrastructure development, of social progress. They're so fundamental to our experience that we rarely acknowledge them. The Vikings couldn't have imagined drinking spaces like ours, not because they lacked imagination, but because the knowledge and infrastructure simply didn't exist yet. The path from their alehouses to our bars required discoveries in microbiology, advances in engineering, developments in public health, social movements demanding better conditions, and even now, in our modern world, the safety we take for granted isn't universal. There are still places where drinking water is unsafe, where public health infrastructure is inadequate, where workers lack protection. The progress we've made is real but incomplete, uneven, requiring constant maintenance and advocacy. Understanding Viking drinking culture, in all its uncomfortable detail, gives us perspective on how far we've come, and reminds us not to take our current conditions for granted. The boring regulations, the health codes, the safety standards that make modern life more comfortable weren't gifts from benevolent authorities. They were hard-won improvements, often resisted, always requiring ongoing effort to maintain. So perhaps there's value in spending hours examining the unglamorous details of historical drinking spaces. Not to mock Vikings, or to congratulate ourselves on our superiority, but to understand the baseline of human experience and to appreciate the often invisible systems that have changed it. But perhaps more importantly, I want to thank you for staying with me through this lengthy exploration. I know it's been long, over 2.5 hours now, and I know much of it has been quite dark, quite uncomfortable. These aren't easy topics to sit with. The parasites, the disease, the exploitation, the suffering, none of it is pleasant to contemplate. But this is what we do here at Boring History for Sleep. We look at the parts of history that don't make it into the highlight reels, the aspects of past life that popular culture finds too unglamorous to depict. We sit with discomfort. We examine details that most people would prefer to skip over. We try to understand how people actually lived rather than how we wish they had lived. If you found value in this approach, the subscribe button is below. No pressure, but it helps ensure more of these deep dives find their way to you. The like button helps as well, though I understand if that feels like an odd thing to do after spending hours discussing parasitic infections and dental decay. For those of you using this video to fall asleep, I hope it has served its purpose. The methodical examination of dark historical realities, the exhaustive detail, the calm measured tone, all of this is designed to occupy your conscious mind while allowing your body to relax towards sleep. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. If you've drifted off already, you won't hear this, but that's also fine. There's no wrong way to engage with these videos, and if you're listening during waking hours, perhaps at work or during a commute, I hope you found something interesting in all of this. Even in the darkest historical realities, there's value in understanding, in acknowledging how people lived, in recognizing both the constraints they faced and the choices they made within those constraints. But now, as we truly approach the end, picture, if you will, a Viking tavern at dawn. The fire has burned down to embers. The revellers have stumbled home or passed out where they sat. Morning light filters weakly through smoke holes in the roof, illuminating the devastation of the previous night. The spilled ale, the scattered vessels, the bodies still sleeping off their intoxication. Outside, the world is quiet. Perhaps it's winter, and snow has fallen during the night, muffling all sound. Or perhaps it's summer, and birds are beginning their morning songs. The settlement is still, that peculiar stillness of early morning before labour begins again. In this quiet moment, before the cycle resumes, before the brewing starts again, before the serving begins again, before the drinking and violence and disease transmission begin again, there's a pause, a breath, a momentary peace. This is the image I want to leave you with tonight. Not the horror of the Viking tavern in full operation, but the stillness that comes after. The quiet moment when all the noise and chaos have temporarily ceased, when sleep has claimed everyone, when the world rests before beginning again. Because that's where you are now, dear listener, at the end of a long journey through dark history, approaching your own moment of quiet, your own stillness, your own rest. You've travelled with me through smoke-filled spaces and contaminated floors, through disease transmission and parasitic infections, through violence and desperation, and all the small miseries of Viking drinking culture. You've sat with discomfort, you've confronted unpleasant realities, you've examined what most people prefer to ignore, and now it's time to let all of that go. Let the Vikings rest in their long-ago past. Let the alehouses crumble back into archaeological sites. Let the suffering and struggle fade into historical record. None of it can touch you now. You're safe, comfortable, in your own time, with all the modern infrastructure and medical knowledge and public health systems that protect you from those medieval dangers. Your bed or chair is comfortable in ways Vikings never experienced. The air you breathe is clean. The water you drink is safe. The structures around you won't burn down, won't collapse, won't expose you to deadly cold. You live in a world Viking ale drinkers couldn't have imagined, and tonight you can rest in that world. So let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles relax, starting from your toes and moving up through your body. Calves, thighs, hips, belly, chest, shoulders, arms, neck, face. Each part of you releasing tension, settling into comfort. Let your mind release its grip on the details we've been discussing. The parasites and disease, the violence and suffering. Let them drift away like smoke dissipating into a vast sky. They're part of history, part of the human story, worth understanding. But they're not part of your immediate present. Right now, there's only rest. If thoughts arise, let them come and go like clouds passing through that vast sky. Don't fight them. Don't hold on to them. Just notice them and let them drift on. Your mind is settling, quieting, moving toward the stillness of sleep. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for your patience with the lengthy examination, your tolerance for uncomfortable details, your willingness to look at history as it actually was rather than as we might wish it had been. If you're new here, welcome to Boring History for Sleep. If you're returning, thank you for coming back. Either way, I hope this has served its purpose. Education or sleep aid, or simply a voice to fill the quiet. Sleep well, dear listener. Rest peacefully. Let the centuries between you and those Viking ale houses stretch out like a protective barrier between then and now. You're safe. You're comfortable. You're exactly where you're meant to be. And when you wake, if you do wake, remember that boring history is still history, that unglamorous details still matter, that understanding the full reality of the past in all its uncomfortable complexity is valuable work. But for now, just rest. Good night.